It's the other way, Mark. They hang off your ears.
It's too complicated for a Brit.
Hi everyone. We're going now on to the afternoon session on this Tuesday. We're starting with a panel now on a consumer session. And we have here, we've introduced you all these people before. Lisa Katsiachvili from Georgia, Mark Oates from the UK, Conor Malloy from New Zealand, and Kurt Yeo from South Africa. We're going to examine consumer access to tobacco harm reduction products around the world. And we've got experts here representing Europe, South Africa, East Pacific, and of course Eastern Europe. So first of all, let's just tell you that the COP10 meeting over the road is financed by assessed contributions. And since we have some people here on the panel we will just let you know that the United Kingdom gives the most amount of money on this, $521,000 the United Kingdom puts towards the COP process, the FCCC. And on the other end of the scale, you've got Georgia, who gives $913. So I thought that's an interesting statistic there. I think the way to start is to talk about access in your own country. So I don't know what the access is for these products is in Georgia. Do you want to give us a rundown of what the situation is in your country?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not sure if this is working. Absolutely. So I wanted to do a quick recap of Eastern Europe generally and also talk about Georgia, because in Georgia, vaping is legal, luckily. But talking about harm reduction and generally government's approach to smoking cessation is practically not present. They're not thinking about that. And Georgia is the country with quite high smoking rates, and the whole Eastern European region has quite high smoking rates. When it comes to Georgia, it's 31%, and it's quite stagnant. It's not changing over the years, and I think that's specifically due to the fact that there is no harm reduction strategy in place at all. Vaping is regulated on the market, but it's illegal. They have, though, increased the excise tax 5 times last year. But the main problem with Georgia is that whenever a vape shop owner, for instance, or an advocate tries to talk about what harm reduction is and how vaping might work as a smoking cessation method for consumers, they are going after those people and penalizing them and basically chasing them not to do so. So there is a vacuum of information, and consumers are not informed about how vaping actually works, and that's a tragedy of it. So I think that's why there is a lower vaping prevalence in Georgia. But generally, I think in Eastern European region, if I can very quickly cover it because it's a very interesting case. I think one of the most interesting cases is Russia, for instance, because, and all of those countries that I will be mentioning have ratified and signed FCTC, yet there are very high smoking rates there. So over the years, these regulations have not been helping them. So back to Russia, they proposed a full-scale vape ban in 2023, but it's still pending. However, there are so many regulations already existing that I think it's equivalent to the full-scale vape ban in Russia. Like, it's not explicitly banned, but then at some point they have a very high smoking rate as well. It was up to 40%, but now it's lower. I think it's 25 or 26%, but they have a very huge population, so 26% or 25% means 30 million people smoking there. And vaping is on the market, but they're making it extremely, extremely hard for consumers to access it because, for instance, online sales are prohibited. You cannot buy vapes online, and also vape shops need to get a license to exist. And in Russia, I think corruption is not an unfamiliar term, so licensing vape shops to exist probably means a very challenging environment for vape shop owners. Not everyone can get it, and that means that those products are not available. Starting from March, flavors also will be banned. It will only be tobacco. So, and there is even a minimum price on vaping, so the government is making them less affordable for consumers. So considering all this information, there is not an explicit full-scale ban in Russia, but they're making it very hard for consumers, so I think it's equivalent to that. And sadly, 300,000 people are dying from smoking every year in Russia, but they're not doing anything about that. And that's a harsh example, in my opinion, how less free governments in Eastern Europe are actually counterproductive, and they don't care about public health. And we shouldn't be ignorant to the fact that for consumers it's very, very hard to raise their voices against government in that sense, because policymaking is not transparent in Russia. They're not considering any kind of public opinion. So I assume it's very hard to change actually their approach to something more progressive. Now, in Eastern Europe, there are other countries like Poland or Czech Republic which are under TPD, but the regulations are less restrictive. However, they should be aware of the fact not to become like Russia and not to make restrictions so severe so that it's impossible for consumers to switch, actually.
So what's the effect on smoking rates in these countries?
Which countries you mean?
The ones you've been mentioning. I mean, is it declining? How fast is it declining? Or is it raising, or is it flat?
Yeah, I mean, it's mostly really high anyways. For instance, in Poland and Czech Republic, even though there are not really high restrictions on vaping, more or less, but I mean, vaping is legal, but at the same time, the smoking rates are high. It's in Poland 24%, and in Czech Republic it's 28%, 26%, I think, if I'm not mistaken. And the sad thing is that the vaping uptake is also really low. In Poland, it's only 1%, so people do not switch. And that's because, and also in Czech Republic, I think it's only 3%. So people do not switch to vaping, and it's very sad because even though it might not be the same case as in Russia, they're not progressing because they're not endorsing harm reduction. They are not putting thought to how to actually decrease smoking rates. And just being a bit more liberal is not enough in this case. They need to think it through and come up with progressive policies.
Yeah. Well, on the flip side of that, we've got New Zealand. You were saying earlier, weren't you, that your smoking rates are declining quite rapidly over there because of the embrace of vaping. Do you want to tell us what the consumer experience is over in New Zealand? I mean, they're available everywhere, or they're available in certain shops? What's happened there?
Yeah, so from a consumer side of things, they're pretty widely available. Most towns have a couple of vape shops that people can go to. There's specialist vape shops that can sell every flavour and a variety of different strengths, and then it's more regulated for convenience stores or gas stations and things that can only sell menthol and tobacco flavours with restrictions on the amount of nicotine, or tighter restrictions on the amount of nicotine that can be in those. But by and large, it's broadly pretty widely available, and everywhere that sells cigarettes, as far as I'm aware, people also have that option of buying vaping products, which I think is an important one, that there's not more restrictive regulations on vaping than on cigarettes.
Okay, let's. We know we want to talk about this. Tell us what's going on between New Zealand and Australia. I mean, New Zealand seemed to have a good hold on declining smoking rates, and yet nothing the same is happening in Australia. Do you want to tell us the differences and just explain from your point of view, actually being over there, what it seems like to you?
Yeah, so the Australian model is very tightly regulated, so they're on a prescription-only model. So that means you effectively have to go to the doctor and tell them you're a smoker and that you want to quit, and then they will give you a prescription. But there's a lot of issues around that. Firstly, just a lot of people don't have the time or can't be bothered going through these processes. For some of them, there's also the stigma of actually having to go and talk to someone about it, or being able to find their way to a specific GP or doctor that's willing to prescribe them vaping products. So in Australia, only 2% of doctors are able to prescribe vaping as a tobacco cessation, a smoking cessation tool. So it's a big problem. But just from personal experience, when I've been in Australia, you can walk into almost any corner store, convenience store, and you ask, do you sell vapes? And they do, and they pull out a bag from under the counter and sell them to you. So even though that they're effectively prohibited, you still have that access, except it's a lot higher risk because you don't know where that product's come from, what's in it. You have no way of tracing back. Say there's a purely well-intentioned product, no one's meant to cause harm or cut shortcuts, but if there's an issue with it, you can't trace it back to the supplier and resolve that problem. And so there's a lot of issues around that, but also in terms of supply to kids, is that if someone's already supplying these products illegally, they're not really going to ask for ID when someone's coming in trying to get it. And so you see that, the prohibition makes it more difficult for people who want to access these products to access them. But then on the other side, it also allows the black market to grow, which inherently comes with a lot more risk, and effectively makes criminals out of people that are trying to live healthier lives.
I just find it hilarious that if Australia can't keep illegal products out, then which country can? I mean, it's got a coastline that is so very, very long. I mean, in Europe, for example, I mean, these products are you've got Belgium, Netherlands, Germany, all close to each other, and if they try and ban it, they've got no chance. But Australia, they're in the middle of nowhere. What's the flight time between New Zealand and Australia?
Depending on what city you're going to, but anywhere from 3 to 8 hours, depending on where you're going. So,
and you're kind of their nearest neighbour.
Yeah, we're the closest.
Yeah. It's amazing. Should we talk about South Africa then, Kurt? We've spoken about some of the policies in South Africa, but what's the view on the ground? Consumers, how's the access for consumers to get hold of these products?
Well, Martin, it's actually fairly easy. I mean, there's no regulation at the moment, so we're in a holding pattern. So vapes are available pretty much everywhere. And I think after the inclusion or the introduction of the vape tax that was applied in 2023, is that when they made it R2.90 a mole, which is double the price of what it makes or costs to make a vape liquid, it's now forced the market to go into disposables. Because in order for you to purchase a disposable, that excise has no impact whatsoever. But if you're an open tank solution with low milligram, high volume, then it becomes incredibly expensive, and the majority of vapors that I've seen are now slowly but surely moving to the disposable route, purely based on price. But then again, we've got to think about South Africa and its social economic situation. We have very high unemployment rate, very high Gini coefficiency. The equality in the country is still very vastly different between the rich and the poor, and the majority of the South Africans would fall under that poor situation. And then, as we've indicated earlier, is that the majority of people who smoke fall into the category of poor. So they would never be able to afford these products on their own. So the reality is that vaping is not going to be the silver bullet in the African context. However, I strongly believe that we should see nicotine pouches, which is a relatively less expensive option, should be something that be endorsed. But then again, we shouldn't be limiting what the options are available. If vaping is something that will work, then that's the product that will work. If nicotine pouches will work, provide it. The biggest issue that I see in South Africa is that we have no smoking cessation strategy at all. The only thing we have effectively done is we have approved nicotine replacement therapies through our medical pharmaceutical board, but that's not made available to the masses through our public health.
What's the uptake of pouches in South Africa? Because they're fairly new just about everywhere, aren't they?
Yeah, I think they're slowly but surely coming in. We're not seeing, obviously, the same level around vaping and that. I'm hoping that we start seeing a far bigger traction, and particularly start seeing nicotine pouches infiltrate the market where it's really needed and where it really could make a great difference, particularly around the people who smoke.
I'll move on to you, Mark. Now, we all know we've been just discussing about the UK and vaping, but you're an expert on Swedish snus, and I want to talk about Swedish snus particularly because obviously across the EU it's banned, and it's still
Apart from
banned.
in Sweden, of course.
It's still banned in the UK, even though we've left the EU.
Yeah.
But you've told me before that do you want to go through what the situation is with snus? Actually, if you're a user of snus, you know, what's it? Is it legal to buy? Is it illegal to use? What is it? And how are people getting hold of it if it's illegal in the UK?
Yeah, so it's illegal to sell the product, but purchasing the product is not illegal. But I remember looking through the House of Commons library and asking for their advice if they could find any evidence of anyone ever being prosecuted for selling Swedish snus, and no one ever has. It's a very underground sort of black market. It's not policed. The police don't care about it. They think it's a trading standards issue. Trading standards don't really care because it's sold, you know, online and through individual dealers. One individual I met, he said he'd been stopped by the police and they'd seen it and they were like, you know, didn't even know the law themselves. And he would go to Canary Wharf, our big financial centre, once a week, and all of his customers would be working on trading floors and in big banks at the top of tower blocks, and they liked Swedish snus because they didn't have to go outside for a cigarette break. You know, the story of Swedish snus being banned in the UK and then subsequently in the EU is one where a lady called Edwina Curry got very concerned about youth uptake. Does that sound familiar? You know, there was a moral panic and they banned a product which could have saved hundreds of thousands of lives in the UK, and then they encouraged the EU to do the same. And then the result there is probably millions of people could have quit smoking through snus but couldn't do so. Britain could easily, if we'd had the combination of snus and then later vaping, we could have easily achieved 5% smoke-free. But coming back to what Kurt said is, you know, a lot of people in public health don't understand is leaving the choice to the consumer. And that's why you need a smorgasbord of options, from heat not burn to vaping to snus to nicotine pouches. And I describe, when I talk to people, I describe what I'd say is like a hierarchy of preference. So a lot of people might put heat not burn as number one, and then number two would be smoking, and then number three would be vaping. So if you take away heat not burn, and that's banned, then they're left to choose option two. And frustratingly, when it comes to snus in the UK, I've argued for its legalization, and more recently with nicotine pouches coming out, people have said, well, we don't need snus because we've got nicotine pouches. And again, by saying that, they show how they don't understand the subject and understand these products, because you can talk to people who use snus and they aren't so keen on pouches. The way the nicotine goes into the bloodstream is slightly different. Nicotine pouches send a higher rush up earlier on, and then it falls away. Whereas snus, you tend to have a more elongated period of nicotine. So I remember one of the groups I run it started out as the Snus Users Association, and then when nicotine pouches came along about 4 years ago, we had a big internal debate about whether it should be the Snus and Nicotine Pouch Users Association. And some people felt very strongly that it shouldn't include nicotine pouches. But the public health don't understand. They think because it's the same method of entry that it's the same thing, but it isn't. Flavors are different and all sorts. Yeah, and so major failing in the UK. We caused the EU then to ban snus, and millions, I think, have died because of it.
And who are the users of snus in the UK? Considering, you know, many tell us it's not a cultural thing. So who are the people buying snus in the UK?
It's a lot more pervasive than people realise. It doesn't advertise itself in the same way vaping does. You don't see a plume of vape in, you know, the late 2000s and start of 2010s. Vaping advertised itself. People are like, what are these people doing? But you know, I'm using some nicotine pouches now, and you don't know. But it's big in football, so a lot of football fans and football players use it. Nicotine, according to the World Anti-Doping Agency, say that nicotine can give a 10.4% improvement on cardiovascular performance. So the footballers are clearly thinking to themselves, well, I can be better at my sport here. And when there's that kind of money on the line and you really care about being good at football, you can see why they do it. Frustratingly, it's led to the FA, Football Association, being worried about it, when really there's no real reason to be worried about a product which is so much safer than smoking. And footballers use caffeine as a performance-enhancing product. So, yeah.
And presumably there's a lot of Swedish expats in London and other places in the UK.
Yeah, I used to buy some Swedish snus from a Swede, and she just would go home and buy it and bring it back. And again, she didn't even realise you can sell it. She just thought it was this product that wasn't here because no one wanted it, but she made good money selling it, yeah.
Okay, on the subject of access to these products, I want to ask all of you this question, because earlier Mark was saying how when he came back to this country and snus was banned, he was forced to go back to smoking. Now the people at COP10 will be saying you shouldn't be using any nicotine at all. As the Rudiger Kretsch said in this speech yesterday, a well-being society is a nicotine and tobacco-free society. So they don't think you should use any of these products. Nicotine. I mean, I know from a friend of mine who's a scientist said that they found archaeologists have found traces of nicotine in skulls that are 12,000 years old. So we've been using this a long time. But what would you say about nicotine use in general? We're asking the question, what's the availability to consumers? What would be your answer if someone says to you, you shouldn't be using it at all? Anyone want to start?
Probably my starting point would be to say that banning something doesn't make it disappear. These products are always, you look at prohibition of any substance or any product over human history, and humans are very innovative when they need to in terms of finding ways to smuggle products, manufacture their own, in the case of alcohol, grow their own. You look at even marijuana in New Zealand, it's illegal. And there's studies that show most New Zealanders have consumed it. Banning something doesn't make it disappear, and so it's about, well, how do you create the environment where people can choose a safer alternative, where they can choose one that doesn't cost them as much, where they're not punished with financial taxes because they're choosing options that are better for them and better for those around them as well.
I think we need to understand that obviously there is a concern around youth use of nicotine, and that's understandable. But I mean, let's talk about now adults. I mean, that's what we should be talking about. And I've always asked this question: is what does a nicotine addiction look like? Since 1984, 1985, when NRTs, nicotine replacement therapies, became pretty much widely used as the route in order to help people quit smoking. Please show me what a nicotine addiction looks like. What are the real health effects of it? And when you have these discussions, they'll say it's the withdrawal. And I say, okay, I understand that, but what does this addiction look like? And I agree that banning doesn't solve any problem. South Africa is a test case in 2020, where a complete prohibition and selling of it, all that it did is it just overnight turned consumers into criminals, literally overnight. And I know of a 70-year-old lady that suddenly had to find herself riding around looking for cigarettes, from shady individuals that are selling these products. But there's no support for that individual who wanted to quit smoking, if she chose to quit smoking. I just think that I mentioned it earlier today, is that we've now moved the goalpost continuously, trying to help people quit smoking, to now trying to control tobacco. Now we're going to control nicotine. My fear is, what's next? What's next? What else do we want to control around this? And I think it just doesn't make sense. I mean, Constantino said it earlier. There's no common sense in any of the things that they're approaching. Nicotine's been around for thousands of years. We understand it. And I also get quite offended when somebody says, but there's no value or no benefit from nicotine. are you meaning to tell me that 1.1 billion or 1.2 billion individuals are wrong? That there's no benefit that they're deriving from this product? So, again, I think we're just moving the goalposts and we're not actually attacking the real scourge in the world, and that's smoking.
I was just going to say...
Why should we think that we should be allowed to use nicotine?
Well, I think humans seek pleasure, and there's nothing wrong with seeking pleasure. And unless you understand that, then you're going to work very hard to stop people doing something that, as was said, they're going to try and do illegally. The black market is going to replace the role of legal markets. And with that, and what's not talked about is the harm caused by black markets. You know, you mentioned the lady in South Africa who had to go and find criminal markets to purchase a product. She was being put at more risk by the state than being able to buy it legally at a corner shop. You know, if you banned caffeinated drinks, then the black market that would appear for them, which would be not a place I'd necessarily want to be involved in. You know, the people selling it could no longer go to the police if someone raided and stole all their coffee beans. So they would use weapon systems to try and protect themselves. You know, so the black market is creating harm, and again, that's completely ignored by the World Health Organization. And I think that one problem we have is that because consumption rates are about 20%, whereas for caffeine is about 75%, is naturally you have a public, they're going to defend the right for themselves to use a product. Whereas they've done so well at stigmatizing smokers and getting that number being lower, is smokers themselves aren't willing to stand up and fight, or nicotine users, and I see this with vapors a lot, they're almost embarrassed by the fact they use nicotine, but they shouldn't be embarrassed. It's pleasurable. I've stopped using nicotine for a period because someone said I wasn't able to, and I did it in about 6 weeks, went cold turkey. It wasn't that hard for me, to be honest. I just decided I wanted to do it. But I went back, not because of any addiction, not really because of any dependency, but because my life was better. My concentration levels were better. My fitness is better. I do some extremely long runs, hundreds of kilometers. I'm better when I consume nicotine. I have to stay up for 36 hours in some of the work I do for maybe 10 days on end with little food. Nicotine is very helpful for that, and there's a reason why, as I said before, sports players and also people in our military doing very difficult jobs consume nicotine. So yeah, I don't think we should be ashamed of using nicotine, and I'm certainly not going to stop consuming nicotine. They can take my vape from my cold dead hands.
Okay, let's talk about a different subject. Obviously, we know that consumers are not allowed into these WHO meetings, and it's almost an aggressive policy to keep us out. Lisa, your organisation, was it 60,000 members you have? What do you think? What do you think consumers could do to try and tackle that and address the WHO banning us from taking part in conversation?
Thank you. And first of all, I think that what they're doing is not a right thing to do, not allowing consumers to be the part of this discussion. And I very much appreciate that we can be here today to discuss all of those topics. But I think they just have their own agenda, and they know this agenda, and they just don't want to hear an opposite opinion. They don't want anyone who will be showcasing the science and how actually smoking cessation works. So I think what consumers should be doing, and we always tell our followers as well and our members as well to keep doing that, is to keep pushing and keep talking to their policymakers if there is a possibility, to politicians, and letting them know that this is an important issue for them, that vaping actually saved their lives. And we usually also contact them so that they can provide us with their testimonies on how they actually quit smoking. It's very important to understand that individual stories matter, and they have the power for politicians. That's something that they're going to listen to. So it's important that the delegates who are present at COP10 have at least skepticism towards what WHO has to say, and that skepticism can be derived from consumers actually talking about those issues and being proactive. So that's something I definitely would like to see, and we at World Vapors Alliance are trying to do.
And let's now talk about Michael Bloomberg, because we have 4 different countries here. What do you think, each of you, the effect of Bloomberg has on people, on policy in your own country? Have you seen signs of Bloomberg money filtering into your country and skewing the debate? Do you want to start, Kurt?
Absolutely. Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids is definitely involved and active within the environment. They're partnered with an umbrella group within South Africa, which is called the Parents Against, well, not Parents Against Vaping. However, the group consists of a number of organizations, including the South African Medical Research Council, Cancer South Africa, Heart Foundation of South Africa. Protect Our Necks is the umbrella group, and Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids is definitely involved in that. And what's spearheading a lot of that is the South Africans National Council Against Smoking. And they have the seat at the table with government and policymakers. If you consider that the South African Medical Research Council is actually an offshoot or a department of the Department of Health in South Africa. So there's definitely a lot of that influence that's happening in there. So yes, there's definitely an engagement, and there is definitely, I would say, an influence from Bloomberg in the entire process, as well as generation of these policies.
And you've mentioned that some of the democratic process is being sidelined by in this consultation you're going through. They're holding meetings in the middle of nowhere and stuff like that. Do you want to explain how that goes on?
So yes, part of South Africa's process of during the creation of a law or an act is a very important part of it is the public participation process, and that typically starts off with written submissions that get handed into the Portfolio Committee of Health, and then by guidelines and the Constitution of South Africa is that particular bill then has to be taken to every province in the country, and actual oral public participation meetings have to be held. And when those meetings are held, it gives the opportunity for the public to engage and share their opinions on the bill, whether they object or aligned with what the bill is stating. Unfortunately, there's a lot of the process has been flawed. For example, communication of where these meetings are going to be held literally will come a couple of days beforehand. So we sit in the dark until that meeting is literally announced, and that will give individuals 2 or 3 days at the most to actually participate or attend those meetings. And then we go to those meetings, and it's all based around raising your hand, and then the chairperson of that meeting will then select who they want to hear from. And we've had a number of occasions where, first of all, the venue was too small for the number of people that wanted to participate. And second of all is that when the session is ended, there's still hands left in the air, giving a lot of those individuals not giving them the opportunity to share. And it actually became quite heated in the Gauteng area, which is the most populous province in South Africa, where both in the Heidelberg hearings and the Pretoria hearings, there was a lot of pressure and a lot of disgruntled individuals that were not allowed into the venue purely because there was insufficient space and not allowed to be given the opportunity to speak. So there's a lot of these processes that haven't been followed, and ironically, 2 or 3 days before this process started with the tobacco bill, the Constitutional Court of South Africa overturned an act where the very same things were done during that process, and the Constitutional Court overturned that particular bill and kicked it back, saying that public participation was insufficient and therefore did not meet it. But we're seeing this happen in this particular bill too. And that's unfortunate, because we go back into this grey area, this holding pattern, and when that's involved, it becomes a free-for-all.
With New Zealand, I don't expect there's too much for Bloomberg-funded groups to get hold of, because your government seems on top of things with this. But I'm going to ask a slightly separate question to you. Do you get any criticism from Australia for embarrassing them?
Not that I've seen, but I'm sure it probably winds up some of the policymakers over there, that they've got the counterfactual there. It's presented to them, where we've got the opposite policy, that opponents of Australia's current trajectory, they can just point across and say, look, this is actually where it's working in a similar country with similar demographics, in a similar part of the world. There's a lot of the variables are taken out, and so I'm sure it annoys some of those people, but I mean, maybe they don't have my contact details, but I'd love for them to get in touch.
Can I just ask, do you think it's going to be possible for Australian politicians to change course? Because they just want to get further and further down the rabbit hole.
I'm an optimist. I hope that, as people become more and more aware, I think part of it is shifting public opinion, and that's part of our role, is making people aware that these harm reduction products that some people try to frame as the same, or if not worse than tobacco, that they're actually a lot safer, and that we should be encouraging people to shift, like we do in New Zealand. I think maybe part of it is that we need to get the WHO to change, and through advocacy like what we're doing now in each country, pressuring their own health officials to make evidence-based decisions. And I think if you do that, and you shift the kind of mindset of the WHO bureaucracy, then perhaps that's when you get change in some of those more, those countries that put their foot down a bit harder.
Yeah, I just want to say that a few years ago, Fiona Patten, who's a politician in Australia, she was in Warsaw, and she described New Zealand as Australia's exciting little nephew running around looking cool, compared with Australia on their stuff with harm reduction, so, which I thought was quite good. Mark, we've noticed in the UK policies changed dramatically in the last month or so, and we noticed a lot of increased media pressure on vaping from almost the 1st of January 2023. Do you think there's Bloomberg action in the UK?
Well, we're the home of Bath University, which receives lots of funding from Bloomberg Philanthropies, and then they own Tobacco Tactics, which I've spoken to journalists, and look, I don't know what goes behind the scenes. They're not exactly transparent with what they do, but it's quite clear talking to journalists that information and stories and often just greyness and dirt they want to plant on people may well be presented by someone. I can't say with any certainty who, but there's a strong suggestion of where it comes from, especially when you look at it, because it compares so well with what is written on Tobacco Tactics. The irony is, I think a lot of us quite like it when we're on Tobacco Tactics. I've been tempted to message them and say, just so you know, you might want to add this information, because it's almost ridiculous. I'm on there and it says Mark Oates has said that he wants to reduce smoking rates and deaths by utilising vaping. It's like, well, yes, I do. I do want to reduce the number of people dying from smoking globally.
An evil man.
Yeah, there's clearly interference. I mean, the thing that's really frustrating about the media in the UK is, if you look at smoking rates in the youth 10, 15 years ago, and especially when I was younger, there are actually higher smoking rates then in the youth than there are now, and smoking rates have absolutely plummeted, but no one's mentioning that. Now, I don't think that, I don't want to see young people under the age 18 vape, but the way to deal with that is through better enforcement, licensing system, and not just a blanket ban that takes away the freedom of adults to use a particular type of product. So, and I think Clive Bates mentioned this in a talk, and he showed the percentage and the numbers of people that are vaping in youth, and it was tiny, and he pointed out how many people, adults, that are still smoking. And he pointed out that we should be really caring about those millions of people, 2/3 of which are going to die, rather than a tiny amount of people who, yes, shouldn't be doing what they're doing, but they're breaking the law, shops are breaking the law, but they're not the ones that are actually going to die from it. So we need to have perspective. I actually contacted a journalist, and they'd written a story in a local paper saying about a father who'd found a vape in their teenager's bedroom. And I contacted them and said, I found some cigarettes in my son's bedroom. And my son's only 4 months old, so they weren't actually his. But the journalist had no interest in publishing that story. So just quickly, I think part of that is to do, I call it new technology bias. So you see an electric car go on fire, or you see a driverless car crash. That's all over the news, but no one mentions the thousands of deaths from conventional cars. And And so for some reason, when a new technology comes along, it really sparks people's interest.
Yeah, it doesn't help when there's a guy called Professor Andrew Bush from, I think it's the European Respiratory Society, and he came out on national TV in the UK and said, yeah, when we used to smoke behind the bike shed, you might get a cough or something, but it wasn't really a problem. But these vapes are lethal. I mean, and he's called himself professor, and he wears a bow tie and goes around trying to be an expert. But yeah, it's that kind of thing. So what about you, Eastern Europe? Is there Bloomberg tentacles getting into there, or do you think they're just where are they taking advice from to come out with bad policies in Eastern Europe?
It's interesting because, like, for instance, I can talk about my own country. WHO is already very authoritative in Georgia, so I'm not sure if they need much more efforts actually to put money into misinformation, even though you can see that. Like, a lot of media is misinforming public about vaping and generally smoking cessation. But yeah, there are some groups, for instance, in Georgia, if you start talking about harm reduction, they're going to go after you. And I'm very skeptical about them. Where are they coming from, or what's their purpose? Because they attack harm reduction. They do not think pragmatically or talk about any other issues. So I mean, there's some kind of evidence that those groups exist in Georgia, but sadly, for instance, WHO is already so authoritative that they don't need any extra efforts in that sense. And on a regulatory scale, it's practically banned to talk about harm reduction. So media cannot talk about harm reduction. No one else can talk about that. So, yeah.
Okay, we've only got a few minutes left. What I'll do, 2 minutes each. I want to go along the panel and say, in your country, what do you think the future is for access to harm reduction products in your country or in your region with you as well? What's the future? You know, short term and long term. How do you see access to consumer nicotine products going in the future?
Yeah, I'm just going to go very quick. I think Eastern European region consists of countries that have very different political background, and that's why just having one answer to that would be hard for me. When it comes to, for instance, Russian restrictions, what I was talking about, I'm not very optimistic that they would suddenly lift without change in their whole system. But when it comes to EU member states, for instance, it would be, we should wait for TPD, and we have soft launched a program, a campaign, and we will be pushing to gather the signatures from the consumers to make sure that policymakers in the EU know that vaping is an important issue for us. And let's see what will be on the table for the TPD next time. I hope it will not mean more restrictions, but of course I'm more skeptical about that. And for the countries like Georgia, it's a developing country, and it's sad because we don't have our policymakers do not sit down and they do not research harm reduction on their own. We do not come up with our own local harm reduction strategy. So whatever the EU will do, if there's going to be a flavor ban all across the EU, we will duplicate it. So hopefully there will be a consumer voice in countries like that too, but generally that's why it's very important to think through all these policies and make sure that on our end, consumer voices are heard, and we let them know that it's an important issue for us, and we'll try our best.
Yeah, so a few trips to Brussels with loads of consumers then, I think, in the future. So Mark, yeah, 2 minutes. What do you think the future in the UK is for short-term and long-term for harm reduction products?
So short-term, we're going to see disposable vapes banned. How they define what disposable vape is going to be very interesting. And then they're talking about banning certain flavors and restricting it to 4. The end result of that is going to be probably higher smoking rates, and within that, a much larger black market. And how much more smoking will go up will be determined by how much of a black market there is. The problem probably won't go away. I don't think you're going to see a dramatic reduction in youth vaping, unless somehow it becomes a non-story because the media just thinks, well, that problem's solved, let's not talk about it. But I think the youth, sadly, will move to other products like pod systems or illegal products, and then we're on the train of Australia, like lemmings following them off a cliff, will go, well, we need to ban pod systems. And then that won't work because the black market, and then you never know, we might have a Labour government, well, we are going to have a Labour government, and they're talking about a prescription model which they have in Australia. Which you know, quite remarkable. In a country where you cannot get a GP appointment, you'll have to get a GP appointment, I think they said about 1 million extra GP appointments a year if they made vaping prescription only. I mean, that's madness. You call up your GP in the UK, you're looking at a month, 3 weeks if you can get an appointment. Yeah. So it's not looking good.
You can be smart here, I think.
No, I mean, I've talked a lot about vaping, but a lot of these other products like the snus and nicotine pouches, you know, are prohibited. And so, but the new government that we've just got in their coalition agreement, they've talked about removing some of the restrictions on smokeless nicotine products. So that's hopeful. What I'm hoping will happen is that consumers end up with more choice and more options, as we talked about earlier, so that we can see different things working for different people. I also think we're probably, purely for political reasons of the government, they're getting a lot of heat for overturning our smoke-free law that the UK is copying. So that I think they're going to actually be trying quite hard to get people to stop smoking with these Vape to Quit campaigns and things like that. And so I'm somewhat optimistic, but you never know. The political tides of the day can change in an instant. So, yeah.
Yeah, so good on vaping, which kind of like the UK was, good on vaping, not so much other products. We're still to have that magic country to come along and embrace everything and then show the world up. That's what I'm hoping for at some point in the future. And lastly, Kurt, on South Africa.
I don't think we're in a good space at all. And it's not just because of regulations. It's to do with this whole social economic situation in South Africa. The reality is that many of the people that smoke in South Africa could not afford these products without some kind of subsidy or some kind of assistance. And much like we see with our campaign against HIV and AIDS, where the state was then forced to grab it by the horns and introduce things like free condoms and introduce things like free ARVs and education programs and you know, prophylactic support and so forth. Unless that happens, we're going to see a large number of people in South Africa still smoking illicit products, which are incredibly cheap, and have no real reason to switch to safer alternatives. We also got to think about the situation many South Africans find themselves in, unemployed, not having too much hope on the horizon, a number of other issues that are far more pressing to them. Giving up the one pleasure they might have is just going to be impossible unless there's that level of cessation support and some kind of subsidy. But then you have to ask yourself, will the South African government be in a position, given the fact that only 7.2 million South Africans pay tax, and there's 20 plus million that rely on social grants, do they have the budget in order to have a program that could support 11 million smokers in the country? So I'm not very confident. However, for those people that do want to make that choice and can afford to make that choice, currently, like we see with the illicit cigarettes trade, as well as many other activities in South Africa, if you have the money, you certainly will be able to make that choice and exercise that choice, whether it be legal or illegal, because law enforcement is absolutely failed completely. So there's, once again, this inequality that's typically now South Africa. Those who can afford it will definitely benefit from it. Those who can't afford it, who are at most at need, are the ones that are going to be suffering. And that's why I still think that South Africa should seriously can the current bill and start talking about cessation strategies.
Yeah, and it comes back round to the WHO promoting policies that promote inequality. Exactly what came up in the last panel. But yeah, thanks very much to all of you. That's very interesting to see what's going on in your countries, and let's hope for the best for the future. And consumers watching, I think the main thing is consumers have to carry on, campaigning to get better access in the future. So just keep doing what you're doing. Thanks very much, all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
In 10 minutes, yeah. And then we swap these two rounds, so it's policy one now and science one's after. And we've got Jeff Home round to the So this is my last one. Before I do regulator watch it.
Yeah.
Thanks, Luca.
Well, it was a bit like starting out with a goal of reducing carbon emissions, and so you're trying to encourage people to drive this and all of a sudden an electric vehicle comes along. I'm not saying no, we still want people to drive this, it's never about.
we ready to go? Has everyone got,
Good.
Yep. Got water and... Okay. So good afternoon, and now we have a session on policy. We've got some people here who are policy experts in this area. We've got Chris Snowden, we have Conor Malloy, we have Jeff Smith on the end, and Adam Hoffer has come back here, the tax expert himself. So we're going to discuss the many different types of regulation on both combustible tobacco products and on harm reduction products, because there are many differing regulatory approaches. So I'm not the expert on this sort of thing. I'm a consumer advocate, so hopefully these guys are going to do all the talking. But should we start? We'll start with the UK because I know the UK. The regulatory approach in the UK is fairly sensible at the moment. Obviously that's changing soon. But do you want to just say how maybe the UK's regulatory approach differs from that in other countries?
Yes, I mean, there is obviously a very, very broad range of regulation around the world, from complete prohibition to relative laissez-faire. As of now, the UK is more on the laissez-faire end of the spectrum. We had the European Tobacco Products Directive, which all EU countries have to abide by, and we haven't got rid of any of the regulations in there since leaving the European Union. We are now looking at having a ban on disposable vapes, some form of packaging controls, some form of retail display ban, and some sort of flavour restrictions, but we haven't had any details about that so far. So it is, and has been since day one, really, a more liberal environment than many. Countries are free to gold plate the Tobacco Products Directive. So, for example, Finland and Hungary have quite stringent flavour bans. They only allow either tobacco or menthol flavours. There's more countries going in this direction. I mean, I can speak to the EU more generally because I edit something called the Nanny State Index, which comes out every 2 years and looks at regulation of various different products, not just e-cigarettes and tobacco, but various products, and ranks the countries according to how nanny state-ish they are. Turkey, incidentally, came top last time, and Germany always comes bottom, and UK's slightly above average, which is to say slightly worse, but not on this particular category of e-cigarettes. So very briefly on Europe, the 30 countries in the European Nanny State Index, I think over the course of the 7 years we've been doing the Nanny State Index, the number of countries that tax e-cigarette fluid has risen from only 2 or 3 when we first started doing it. It was like Portugal and a couple of others, to about 15 now. There's also the issue of indoor vaping bans, which, again, there weren't very many of them when we started doing it in 2016. There's now, I think, a slight majority of those 30 countries have an indoor vaping ban, which nearly always is essentially the same rules as apply to smoking. So anywhere you can't smoke, you can't vape. I see it's the same in Panama, and it seems to include a huge range of outdoor areas as well, and it seems to be quite widely flouted. We don't look at how much the laws are actually enforced in the Nanny State Index. But yeah, you essentially you have the taxes, you have the restrictions on where people can vape, you have a couple of countries that ban heated tobacco, and then varying degrees of taxation on heated tobacco. And you have a growing number of countries that are restricting flavours, Netherlands being one of the more recent ones, and also the nicotine pouches. 1 or 2 countries have started banning them. Again, the Netherlands seem to be particularly puritanical last few years. I think Belgium's in the process of banning the nicotine pouches. I'll be doing the Nanny State Index again towards the end of this year, and we'll have another look. But generally speaking, the tide of regulation is getting worse rather than better. The introduction of the Tobacco Products Directive actually did have the effect of getting some countries to be a bit more liberal. So e-cigarettes were banned completely, or de facto banned, in Denmark, for example, and I think Finland also, 1 or 2 other countries. And when the EU said, well, we're not going to ban them, we're just going to regulate them, a few countries actually got more liberal. But since then, as with all these areas, whether it's vaping, smoking, drinking, sugary drinks, or what have you, the tide of history seems to be very much going against consumers, and there's very little chance of that changing. Clearly not in the UK, and probably not when the next European Tobacco Products Directive comes into force, or is tabled.
Okay, great. Thank. I'm glad you brought in the European Union there, which is really helpful because there is such a different number of regulatory approaches just within a union, which is supposed to be about harmonising the markets. You know, that's the idea anyway. So we'll go from one union to another. Do you want to start about either of you two about the USA? You know, what's the regulations there? I mean, you have 50 different states with different regulations, don't you?
Go for it.
I'll take it. Just like you alluded to, the U.S. is a pretty complicated regulatory marketplace when it comes to both traditional tobacco products as well as the more modern, novel alternative nicotine delivery systems that exist, vaping products. Like to refer to them as ENDS products, so people don't understand it when I say electronic nicotine delivery systems, because vaping could be lots of different things, not just vaping nicotine. To heat-not-burn products as well as oral tobacco and non-tobacco nicotine products. The federal level, per se, there's not necessarily a nationwide ban on an ENDS product or a oral alternative nicotine product or heat-not-burn products, but there's a de facto ban in the sense that the FDA has, Center for Tobacco Products, haven't been efficient at evaluating and reviewing products to allow for them to be marketed legally in the United States. So as long as a product has an application under consideration, they can still legally sell that product at convenience stores or other markets within the states. Now, at the state level, states have been, depending on the state, have been more proactive at allowing for laws that will ban flavors. Obviously, California is probably the best example of both flavor bans for reduced risk products across the board, and the consequences that have occurred since the ban went in place we can talk about as we go forward. But it really becomes very complex because it's not even just at the state level. At the city, municipality level, individual cities can put bans forward and allow the consumers, turn the consumers in those cities and towns into criminals because they are purchasing these products from the illicit market. So it's not a clear pathway to a regulatory environment that is easy for the consumer to understand, nor is there a pathway for a regulated environment that allows for enforcement of the laws that are put into place, regardless of if it's performed at a federal level, a state level, or a city level. So I don't think, in terms of trying to come up with an omnibus example of what is good and what is right in the U.S. and what is good and what is right or wrong in the U.S. is an easy question to answer. The diversity of different approaches really depends on both the individuals at the federal level figuring out what the right approaches and the right science is necessary to get products into the marketplace, what those standards and practices should be, which has taken well over 15 years for them to figure it out when it comes to non-combusted products. They've been pretty good at allowing for a pathway for combustible products to enter the product marketplace pretty efficiently. But as it comes to the alternative products, have yet to see indications that they have figured out the pathway to make it easy for manufacturers to get these products into the hands of consumers. And then at the state level, and at the local level, it becomes a rubric of depending on individual impassioned individuals on both sides of the fence fighting to try to protect consumer rights in those spaces.
Yeah, I mean, I'll add to that. I think if I were to characterize generally what it looks like in the United States at the federal level, it is just a really slow, I mean, unlike in almost any other space in the country where innovation is encouraged and allowed, and you can bring your products to the market and test them out there, the FDA puts up a barrier for nicotine and tobacco products. So you have to get approved through them before you can sell your market or your product in the United States. And they've been extraordinarily slow at approving products on the market. Now, that doesn't mean that some products haven't entered the market anyway, or that some products operate in this limbo state. But generally speaking, at the federal level, the FDA is really slow at approving new products to come onto the market. Most states have taken the approach of legalize, tax, and regulate. So the states are very happy to collect their extra tax revenue, but like we just heard, the policies are all over the place. Vaping taxes, for example, range from 5 cents per milliliter up to a 95% wholesale tax in Minnesota, for example. And so one of the things that this has done is it's actually given us a nice wealth of data to evaluate what happens from these various policies. And we can see, so for example, in that Minnesota wholesale tax, we saw that there were researchers at the National Bureau of Economic Research. They did the study that found that this 95% wholesale tax prevented 20,000 smokers in the state of Minnesota from switching to an alternative product. Now, I think that data should be pretty convincing for what best practice policy should look like, right? I think we want to encourage smokers to move from combustibles to other products. But it really is a messy landscape in the United States, but it has given us a lot of data to try to evaluate how these policies work.
Okay, I'll just ask a quick question on the back of that. Like you said, this is the same thing as in Europe. We've had a natural experiment with snus use in Sweden and the rest of the EU. And Sweden is winning hands down. I mean, I think their prevalence of smoking is 5.6%, and I think we're next in the UK with 13%. So it's not even close. And yet still, public health don't seem to recognise this and don't seem to take it on board. Do you think that the regulations that the difference in regulations in the states, if they do show a stark reality of more liberal you are, the better smoking declines you get, do you think public health will take it into account?
I don't like the phrase liberal. I think rational is really where I put things leads into my metrics to trying to solve this problem. If you look at Sweden last year, they increased the taxes once again on combustible products and decreased the tax burden on snus. And as a behavioral scientist, I don't think about any behavior from the perspective of what is a single lever that is going to change behavior from good to bad, from healthy to unhealthy. It's really multifaceted. And the cost of a product is one of those levers that you can adjust to encourage individuals to move away from an unhealthy product to a more healthy product or a less risky product. Flavor falls in that same characterization as well. If I enjoy the flavor of a reduced risk product, instead of demifying me for that, because I like a flavor, it's encouraging the individual to switch away from something that at one time they enjoyed equally or more, but because this new flavored product has a characteristic that they prefer over the traditional cigarette, that encourages them to switch. So the cost is a driver, flavor is a driver, nicotine is a driver, and then also underlying it all is that it's an improved health outcome as well, which is much more difficult to sell to a consumer because they are using the product for enjoyment for whatever reason they're using it for. And unfortunately, with a cigarette, very rarely do you smoke one and immediately develop a health problem. It takes years of use of that product. And so health isn't a big driver in terms of understanding the risk associated with the products they use, but enjoyment is. Cost is. If it costs way less for me to switch to use a reduced risk product, and I'm going to save lots of money as compared to purchasing cigarettes, that's a driver that's going to move a smoker into these reduced risk products more efficiently than it would be if they were equally priced. And so I think, again, when, again, policymakers, politicians, revenue generation is a big priority for them. If they're losing money in certain areas, they either have to increase taxes in other areas or see if there are other areas that are going to be less, of a negative perception around from a voter's perspective in terms of increasing the cost. If you're just switching the burden of generating that revenue from a smoker who is generating revenue through his or her smoking habit to a smoker that's now a vapor, which is, in terms of economic cost to society, a much lower burden, but they were paying that tax beforehand anyway. We might as well put that burden back onto the cost and generate that revenue there instead of coming up with a new tax on, kiwis or whatever the case may be, right?
My short answer on the regulatory scene in the United States, in terms of experts from the health community incorporating this evidence into their policies, I have very little optimism of things happening at the federal level. I think the FDA is really in this, and I'll use this term again, they're stuck in this paranoia, this nicotinophobia of bringing any more nicotine products onto the market. They're just really slow, and they seem very reluctant to do it. I'm more optimistic of what's happening in U.S. states, and sometimes states are willing to disregard what the federal government says. And there's been an enormous movement to legalize and tax cannabis in the United States. And a lot of these, what we're seeing in a lot of state houses, some pushback from legislators saying, how is it that we have agreed to legalize and tax cannabis, but we can't have flavored vapes? This is inconsistent.
Yeah.
And so I'm optimistic that we'll see some policy movement at the state level. Not all states, but in some states.
Yeah, the cannabis question is very challenging because from my perspective, there's really no argument in terms of risks associated with even combustion of tobacco versus combustion of cannabis. They're both, the death and disease over time is still coming from combustion in both cases. The difference with cannabis is that it's an intoxicating drug. And so I know when Colorado legalized years ago, the average joints per day was something for a smoker of cannabis was something like half a joint a day. Just a few years post legalization, it went up to 9 joints per day. And that's two things. That's deeply inhaling a combusted product 9 times, well, double, more than 9 times a day. And then you're intoxicated for those at least 9 hours of the day as well. And so there's other sociological consequences associated with the legalization of cannabis. Now, I'm not against the legalization of cannabis, but it's just the reality of understanding the logic of one argument versus the logic of a second argument. And at the end of the day, from a scientific perspective, which should influence policy, that's the reason why I do what I do, is to try to bring that scientific light into the conversation around policy, is that you can't think about one policy as it affects one product without considering its context in another. And they're so divided in terms of the way people support legalization of cannabis without any constraints of flavors and formats and routes of administration, but have really put up barriers that will allow individuals that have a long history of use of a combusted product to have legal access to products that they both enjoy and will improve their health in the long run. It just doesn't make any kind of logical sense to me whatsoever.
Okay, thanks. Connor, I'll talk to you on a more parochial thing on New Zealand specifically, because I'd heard a few years ago that the dairies are kind of like what we call convenience stores or tobacconists or newsagents. They were being attacked quite a lot, weren't they, by gangs and what have you? Was that because of the high taxation of tobacco products? And wouldn't this have been made much, much worse if you were going to cut down the number of outlets that sell these products from 6,000 to 600, as was planned under the last government?
Yeah, so one of the things when I head overseas, and it shocks a lot of people when I tell them about this thing we have, which is called a ram raid, which is where generally it's a kid aged somewhere from 12 to 16 years old will steal a car, drive the car through the front of a shop, so sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes during the day, just to break through any barrier that's there, quickly grab whatever they can, chuck it in the car or in a second car and drive off. And we were at a point last year where there was one happening every 15 hours in the country. And that was not just at dairies, but jewelry stores, electronics shops and everything like that. But it was also happening at tobacco retailers because the tax on cigarettes was so high that if, it's about 40 New Zealand dollars for a pack of cigarettes. And so if you can steal that and get a couple of cartons of those and then flick them off for $20 each, that's a lot of money that you can make. And so with the government's proposed smoke-free legislation, one of the limbs of that was reducing the number of stores from over 6,000 down to just 600 across the entire country. New Zealand's a big place, so some communities wouldn't have a single store near them, which not only punishes people that don't have the time or the money to travel further away, but it makes it less accessible more generally. But one of the risks that people rightly pointed out is that in some areas they would have to keep enough cigarettes to supply, I think, one sale every minute for the number of smokers in that area, and they would have to change the delivery times so that they're not having this same large number of cigarettes coming every week, because it's hundreds of thousands of dollars that they would have in stock. It created a huge, it would have created a huge crime risk, even more than what we already have. And we've got a big gang problem in New Zealand, and so what that does is it empowers the gangs. They're more, they've got more money, they can become more organised, and they can do more of their other activities that cause more harm in the community. But it also means that those people that want to consume cigarettes, that can get it cheaper on the black market, they go there, and then that's where they get offered other products and say, hey, we don't have any nicotine for you today, but have you tried this? Or, you know, oh, you don't have enough money for your cigarettes today. Okay, we can just do an IOU and sort that out later. And when you're dealing with you know, people who can't go to the courts to get you to, you know, fulfill your contractual obligations, they resort to other means. So there's a whole heap of other flow-on effects when you restrict supply and encourage that black market to tick up.
Yeah, when I was surprised recently in Warsaw when Mara Glover pointed out she superimposed New Zealand over Europe, and it basically goes from Scandinavia right down to Spain. I mean,
Yeah.
It's a huge country. You think of it in comparison to Australia, because you see it on a map next door, that it's small, but it's not. You know, to have only 600 shops supplying every smoker in New Zealand is mad. But they've scrapped that law now, haven't they? They've scrapped that, and I understand, I saw something recently saying that they're not increasing taxes on tobacco as well. Is that true? Yes. And they're not doing the generational age ban as well, the smoke-free generation?
Yeah, so the smoke-free law had three parts. One was the reduction in stores. One was denicotization, so it would reduce the amount of nicotine that could be in cigarettes. And then the third one was that smoke-free generation. So all three of those are now gone. In terms of, sorry, I've forgotten the second part of your question.
I've read somewhere recently that they're not going to increase tax on tobacco products.
Yeah, so at the moment, so for years we had 10% annual hikes. So you think 10% over multiple years, it compounds and gets bigger. So we won the battle against that, showing that wasn't contributing to smoking rates declining. So we went to, from then on, just an inflation adjustment each year. And the new minister, who's responsible for the smoking legislation, health officials came to her and said, we can provide you with advice on a number of things. And they listed a whole heap of areas that they could provide advice on, one of which was hiking cigarette taxes, one of which was freezing cigarette taxes. And so she circled yes on all of them and said, I would like advice on everything. All options are on the table. And the Ministry of Health officials wrote back her advice and said, you have requested information on freezing cigarette taxes, sent it to her, and then sent a copy to the media. And then for the past couple of weeks, our headlines have been, Minister wants to freeze cigarette taxes after overturning, and then there's this whole big palaver about it. That wasn't what she asked for. A couple of weeks earlier, she had just done the annual inflation adjustment. So as far as I'm aware, then they're not actually considering freezing cigarette taxes. My personal view is set it at a level that can kind of recoup the costs and then keep it, adjust it so it stays in line with inflation. I think that's fair. But I think the far better lever you can pull is allowing more of these alternative products as we have.
I mean, if I like comment on that, all three are parts of that Jacinda Ardern plan. If you know your history of this area, these are not new ideas. They were presented as being radical ideas. They've actually been floating around for decades. The idea of taking nicotine out of cigarettes has been cropping up ever since the 60s. You know, And it's always been knocked down because people work out that this is basically harm maximization. It's not going to work. You're effectively banning. It's prohibition. I mean, the sliding age scale thing was really a distraction. And the real prohibition was taking the nicotine out of cigarettes. Of course it was. And these people will say, "Oh, well, it's not prohibition because people can still buy cigarettes." Well, during literal prohibition of alcohol in America, you could still buy beer, so long as it had less than 0.5% of alcohol in it. But everyone, including the prohibitionists, knew it was prohibition, right? So, and then what else is there? The restricting the number of shops. Yeah. Oh, well, people buy cigarettes from shops. If we restrict the number of shops that sell them, we're bound to reduce the amount that people buy. No, you're giving a golden ticket, basically, to a small number of people in what is basically an oligopoly. And the sliding age scale thing, that was been around for a good 20 years. There were a few countries a while ago thinking of making 2000 the cutoff point. It seemed like a neat thing to do. Anyone born in the 21st century would never be able to buy a cigarette. But of course they missed the boat. I think Singapore and a few places like that, the usual, Thailand and so on, were thinking about doing it, but they missed the 2000 deadline. So now it's 2009 in the UK now because we just copied it from New Zealand. There's all these ideas. But my point is, I guess, that they're really scraping the barrel now. That they're having to come up with things that only the absolute lunatic fringe been talking about. The issue apparently being put before COP this week, one of them seems to be something to do with banning filters. That keeps coming up now and again. Let's ban filters. Well, firstly, actually, there is evidence that filters do reduce risk. I know tobacco controllers just deny this now, but actually there is quite good evidence. In fact, one of the reasons that they think, I don't know if you're aware of this, but they quite decades ago, there was epidemiological evidence showing that menthol smokers had much lower rates of lung cancer than people who don't use menthol cigarettes, and that doesn't seem to make any sense. And the theory seems to be that the menthol smokers, bear in mind we're going back quite a long way with this study, menthol smokers, by definition, were using filtered cigarettes, whereas a lot of people they were comparing them to were using unfiltered cigarettes. So again, it's harm maximization policy to start with, but also good luck with all your limits on tar yields and nicotine yields if you haven't got filters. It's again, either they don't understand the product they're trying to regulate, or they're just trying to bring in prohibition by the back door. You ban filters, yeah, but you can't have more than so much tar. It's like, well, we can't make a cigarette with so little tar without filters. Yeah. So it's just one bad idea after another in the area of tobacco. I don't know, we're mainly here to talk about the reduced risk products, but it shows how much they're struggling now to find anything to throw at the smoking issue. And of course, the answer, as we all know, is actually to give people alternatives.
Well, and it does kind of feed into what I was going to talk about next anyways, which is the precautionary principle. Because you and I know, Chris, that when vaping first came about in the UK, I remember writing about it back in 2008, when it's very, very new. But it only went really mainstream in the UK around about 2011, 2012. And then we had this glorious period between then and 2016 when the Tobacco Products Directive regulations came into the UK, where you had a perfect free market. I mean, this was working perfectly. People were just going and choosing to go and buy vapes, and the smoking declines just went down and down and down. And then the regulators came in. Why the regulators came in, some consumers could never work out. They said, look, we'll just go and buy it. We're doing what you told us to. We're quitting smoking. We're going to buy these vapes, and we're feeling better. We love them. Thank you very much. And they're saying, well, why are you going to regulate them? And this is why I'm going to mention the precautionary principle, because a lot of people say, well, were you just regulating for regulation's sake? I mean, what are you regulating for? And all the regulations seem to be very, very strict and overweening. Like I said, the EU was aiming firstly prescription only, when there had been no indication of any harms from these products whatsoever. So how much of this regulation is actually regulation that's sensible, and how much of it is all over the world, in the US, in Europe, and in where you are, how much of it is just precautionary and really over the top?
Again, everybody has varying opinions about this question, and I tend to be more pragmatic about it. We no longer talk about batteries exploding in individuals' pockets anymore, and that's due to regulation and better manufacturing processes and oversight in that space. Nobody, in terms of closed systems, the e-liquids are standardized to the point where one pot is going to have the same constituents as the next pot is going to have. So there is and then finally, if something does go wrong with a product that's in the marketplace, there's a way to.
Can I just, I need to disagree with you on this one. With the batteries, the TPD in the EU, of all the things that they could have regulated, they regulated, they've stupidly regulated, said you can only have in tiny little 10 ml bottle, you can only have nicotine up to 20 milligrams in strength, which for no reason whatsoever. It's just like what they thought of. The one thing that was killing people or hurting people was batteries blowing up, and they didn't regulate that.
But it comes along with
The industry did that themselves. They regulated their devices. So I'm
because
just.
they had to stand behind their products.
Yeah, I mean that's just the EU I'm talking about. I don't know what it was like in America. Just
So there are in the final is that if something does go wrong with a product, if it's appropriately regulated, there's a way to withdraw that product from the marketplace through track and trace in terms of sales. So there are positive aspects of regulation, but when it comes to regulating behavior through law, human behavior through law, then that becomes where there's regulatory overreach. And I don't think there is a scenario that anyone can state as an example of where regulatory law has come in and said humans must do this and only this, and that has been successful. If anybody can come up with one where they've shown that there is a success rate in terms of mandating control over the population through regulatory law, then I'll change my opinion. I'm a scientist. You provide data that shows something different, but nobody's yet to provide that information to me. So I think what's unfortunate about the whole the history of regulatory control over behavior is that nobody has learned from the past to understand that there are right levers that you can affect change through, and there are wrong levers. They all consider any lever to be a lever that needs to be, that if it's politically attractive for whatever reason, a lever that they can press at their own whim. And so again, I don't think that there is a black and white, good and bad answer to the question of where regulators should and should not impede choices made by consumers. The most successful is to give consumers the options and choices and assume that, not just assume, but have controls in place to allow for if something does go awry through the consumer choices, those products can be withdrawn for the protection of public health.
So I think that's the point the regulators miss the most. We've seen them in the United States, roughly 5 or 6 years ago. There was a very large spike in youth vaping, which is understandably concerning, right? These were people who were not supposed to be using the products in the first place, but they were. So then regulators came in and they clamped down on, well, pretty much everything, right? This is the sort of regulator toolkit, is to hit everything with a really blunt hammer and hit it as hard as you can. And the result has been, there are still no flavored products, approved by the FDA for sale. However, if you look at actual sales, we have estimates range for the flavored disposable vaping market in the United States, 60 to 97.9% of the market are all illicit products. So they're still for sale. People are buying them, and now the regulators have lost all control on product quality, on being able to pull products from shelves, and so by completely prohibiting a category of products from sale, they've lost the ability to make marginal improvements or to remove bad actors from the market.
So by being too precautionary, they've actually lost control, and it's ended up harming people more than it should do. Yeah.
Exactly. Again, the overwhelming majority of this market is, you can look at brand by brand, and the overwhelming majority, they're headquartered in China, and they ship them to the United States. The profit margins are massive for retailers. There's no enforcement authority, almost no enforcement authority to remove them from shelves, so they're just sold as if it's a normal product. One of our colleagues made the comparison. It feels like late age prohibition, where everyone had just sort of gone, well, this isn't really working, so we're just going to pretend like it's not a law, and it's this gray market where stuff that isn't legal for sale is being sold anyway, and regulators are completely out of the market.
Chris, precautionary principle, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's hugely misused across the board by people who don't really understand what it means. This might sound like a slight digression, but the COVID-19, during the pandemic, in Britain we've got this bloody COVID inquiry. It's going on for about 4 years. It's costing tens of millions of pounds. They've clearly already made up their mind that we should have been essentially locked down for about 2.5 years, and that was all there was to it. But they had the chief medical officer on, Chris Whitty. He was giving evidence a few weeks ago, and as far as the people who are running this inquiry are concerned, the precautionary principle means that as soon as you hear about a new virus, you just lock everybody down, basically. And therefore, we should lock down very, very early, and we should have come out of lockdown very, very late. And Chris Whitty, to his credit, because he was something of an advocate of lockdowns himself, said that that's not what the precautionary principle means. I mean, the precautionary principle doesn't just mean that you take the most severe form of action for the slightest reason. Now, the precautionary principle doesn't give you a very clear model of exactly what to do, frankly. It's just a phrase that people use to justify various bits of regulation when they don't really have a lot of evidence for it in practice. Environmentalists use it all the time to ban all sorts of emerging technology, which may very well turn out to be extremely good for human health and well-being. But there's no long-term evidence. You know, we obviously hear this all the time with vaping. There's no long-term evidence, even after 15 years of people like me using it. So I think it was Clive Bates who said that, you know, the precautionary principle and the idea of being sort of erring on the side of caution is actually embracing. It's reckless, basically. It's embracing very clear and obvious risks that we can all see when it comes to a product which is or promises to have positive health effects, whether that's a drug being kept off the market because we don't know the long-term effects, so we'll leave. Imagine if we'd done this with the COVID vaccine. You know, we don't know the long-term effects of the COVID vaccine. Obviously, we didn't. We didn't know the short-term effects, actually, when we first brought it out, hence the AstraZeneca one really being taken off the market after about 6 months in Britain. That's not my point, but you can obviously apply this to any technology. We don't know the long-term effects of mobile phones, but the reality is that we have no particular reason to think that they're causing any particular damage outside of maybe social media use by kids. But you know, we have enough evidence, both epidemiologically and just, you know, what I would call normal science, in that, well, what's in the thing? What's it doing? Is this really going to cause brain cancer? Probably not. You know, with this, it's like, yeah, well, it may turn out that a particular flavoring ends up having some horrible effect on the lung, but it's not obvious why that should be so. And so, yeah, the precautionary principle is used by people when they don't have evidence to support a ban for something, to say, well, just in case something that we can't even imagine might happen, we'll have to ban it straight away. It's a cop-out. You've got to have some kind of evidence, or at least some kind of plausible theory as to why something is going to cause harm. And in the case of alternative nicotine products, you obviously got to compare it to the very real risks of smoking as well. That's the other thing which the WHO hate doing. They would just compare it to breathing in fresh air.
Yeah, it's an interesting point about your comments, is that there is a difference that exists when thinking about long-term harm of a product today that didn't exist, say, 80 years ago when cigarettes had their rise in use across the globe. We have modern toxicological procedures now that can predict through modeling what the levels of risks are for products such as electronic nicotine delivery systems, heat-not-burn products, and oral products, and biomarkers of potential harm and biomarkers of exposure. And those data, even though it's not 30 real years going into the future, can predict that these products are significantly less harmful than a cigarette any day of the week. And so when people ask me, well, I don't know what these products are going to look like, how can you tell me that these products aren't going to create a problem down the road? Well, I can't tell you 100% because I'm a freaking scientist. I never tell anybody that something is 100% right or 100% wrong. But I can tell you, based on the current tox data and the current methods that we have, which are well more advanced than what we had 50, 60, 70 years ago, that the probability of having any kind of long-term health consequence of using these products is extremely low. Whether it's 95% safer or 50% safer, regardless, it is safer than combustion products.
I mean, one of the problems is that kind of quack public health is very, very heavily dependent on observational epidemiology, as if that's the only science out there. The only thing you can do is basically give people lots of surveys and then wait 50 years.
And it's
to
wonderful
see what
when you
happens.
have that data like we have in Sweden. We have 50 years of this news,
Yeah.
this news data, and it's
Very
beautiful.
interesting, yeah,
But I can also look back at this news product and run those same tox evaluations
Right.
today and say, well, if we were evaluating the toxicology risk of these products back then, we would have predicted that very low indicators of any kind of potential harm that would exist
Yeah.
50 years down.
But that would require you to have real scientific knowledge about toxicology and biology, which a lot of these people don't have.
That's our job,
Because
well, my job.
Anyone pretty much
Yeah.
can run an observational epidemiological
Yeah.
trial. And also, by the way, when people say, we didn't know that cigarettes cause cancer for 50, 60, 70 years or whatever, with the knowledge that we have, even if smoking, even without having the lessons from tobacco,
Yeah.
if the cigarette suddenly came on the scene now, based on what we know from other areas and from toxicology and human biology and so on, we would be able to identify very, very quickly that this was a major threat to health.
Absolutely.
It's just that the cigarette didn't come out in an industrial form until the 1880s when people didn't know anywhere near as much as we do now. So it's not comparable.
Did you want to?
I would probably the precautionary principle probably applies to some of these other products that we don't have in New Zealand. So obviously vaping's the main harm reduction tool, and I think politicians are always skeptical about taking their hands away. They're very quick to put their hands on other people's lives, but very slow to take them away. And I think the new government's probably got a slightly better approach to it. They're more open to actually looking at, well, what is the risk of these bad things happening? And if these bad things happen, how bad will it be? And so to take an example, they're looking at some of our regulations around earthquake requirements for buildings. And the previous government did the analysis looking at the costs of these regulations in terms of strength requirements and all of that kind of thing. And they figured out the cost per life saved. They could have saved like thousands more lives than this could have ever hoped to by, say, investing that in other kinds of medicine or anything like that. And the economic cost of the government spending money on this or requiring the economy to spend money on one thing, by its virtue, it takes it away from somewhere else. And so the new government is being a lot more open to exploring and saying, well, do these regulations, rather than being overly precautious, does it help? And another example in the pharmaceutical sphere is they want to allow more medicines to be approved in New Zealand if they're approved by 2 overseas regulators that are of a higher standard. And that's the kind of approach of the new government. So I'm more hopeful.
Well, you kind of introduced there the concept of trade-offs.
Yeah.
Chris, you talk about this a lot, don't you? I mean, do policymakers and regulators think enough about trade-offs when they're imposing regulations on this sort of product? Do they think through those trade-offs? Do you want to?
Yeah, well, the weird thing is that even though everyone knows how bad smoking is for your health, it's sort of baked in, as it were. People are so used to the fact that lots of people die from smoking every year. It's not a new problem, and although clearly politicians want to do something about it, public health people want to do something about it, it's sort of there, and it's almost it's naturally in the background of everything we do. Whereas, if there are any problems in the future with alternative nicotine products, and a politician hasn't done something about them, that's kind of their fault, or it feels like it's going to be kind of their fault. So that is where it sort of becomes precautionary, erring on the side of caution. But of course it's not, for the reasons I said before, that you're actually being reckless because you've got a known risk. It's this that known risk is kind of not anyone's fault, apart from maybe the tobacco industry. It's not the politicians' fault. They do what they can. We put the tax out, we do what we can, but we can't stop people smoking. So we've got this panic at the moment, which has led to Rishi Sunak banning disposable vapes because about 4% maybe of 11 to 17-year-olds are using a disposable e-cigarette on a roughly regular basis. As recently as 2012, there were 8% of kids of that age who were smoking.
12%.
Huh?
12%.
Was it 12% back in 2012? Okay. And no one thought that was good, but it was very unexceptional. It was like, well, kids are about to pick up smoking. We can't stop every kid from smoking, obviously. Literally no one, even the most extreme anti-smoker, going, we need to ban cigarettes because 12% of the kids are using them. but you get 4% of kids using disposable, we've got to ban those. Despite the fact you've got 2.6 million adults who have used them to give up smoking or to be at least a stepping stone to giving up smoking. So it's kind of a psychological problem, is that in that people, they fear the potential new threat much more than the known existing threat.
Yeah, and I think at the moment in the UK, it's either 2% or 1% of kids are actually smoking regularly. You think people would be celebrating this win, wouldn't you? I want to ask a bit of off-the-wall question. When smoking bans went around the world, public place smoking bans, they all kind of relied on science. Whether you agree with the science and thought it was solid science or not, or thought it was a bit dodgy, at least there was a reason there. They said, look, that secondhand smoke can kill people around you, so therefore, for the public good, we have to put in place these bans. But we were talking just now when, Chris, you went through some of the stuff in Europe. They're bringing in vape bans, and there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever that vapor harms bystanders at all. So does that really sort of trash the idea that these sort of environmental smoking bans and vape bans are actually about health?
I can jump in on that because it is somewhere where New Zealand treats vaping and smoking the same as the locations that you can do it. So they incorporated vaping into the Smoke-Free Environments Act, and so that pretty much restricts it from workplaces, indoor workplaces, schools, government buildings, you name it, they've banned it, and including restaurants and things like that. And with vaping, there's a lot of the science out there is that there's not the same harm of secondhand smoke, and possibly actually allowing private businesses to choose whether or not people are allowed to vape in those businesses could encourage some people to shift over to vaping. And so I think that would be something that I would support looking at. In my own city in Wellington, they've just banned outdoor vaping at restaurants that back onto the footpath. So if you've got an outdoor dining area that's onto the footpath, you're not allowed to vape in that area. However, if you step out onto the footpath, I don't know if you're legally allowed to vape there, but the restaurant doesn't care. So they say, oh, just step one step that way, and then you're fine. And so
stand in the middle of the road, it's fine. Yeah.
Yeah.
Your safety first.
Precisely. And so it's that's one of the areas where we do have quite a bit of silliness.
I mean, I've even heard. I think it was Lindsay told me that there's airlines in the USA have banned you using nicotine pouches while you're flying.
On my flight Sunday, when they make that announcement, as per tradition, I put a snooze pouch in my mouth just to stand up to the man, as they say.
So that's actually true. Airlines ban snooze.
Smokeless tobacco. Yeah.
Do they give any justification for that?
It looks good on their advertising. I mean, there's no scientific rationale for it. But
is anyone going to pick that flight because they know no one's using smokeless tobacco?
It's a generalized phrase of smokeless tobacco. I'm sure if somebody was using chewing tobacco or whatever, and it's in the glass and it spills, I'm sure that's fine. So they ban basically all of it instead of trying to talk about the differences between a snooze pouch and other snuff-like products and so forth. But I think the construct behind it all is just the idea that they have to equate any alternative nicotine delivery product to smoking. And because that becomes easier for them to justify any type of law that prohibits a behavior in public, because if it is equivalent, if we use the idea of secondhand smoke, well, it's aerosol, not a smoke. It's made up of very different constituents. The way that it lands onto the ground, the way that it floats through the air, is physics are very different between what is produced by an ends product versus what's been produced by a combustible product. Yes, it's a bit more sticky, so when it lands on a surface, it stays a little longer than a smoke would. So if a kid comes and licks the table, then there is a risk of exposure in that sense. But in general, it's really easier to control the behavior by lumping it all in as one than to try to look at the differences between them and make different rules.
I get very frustrated when the signs say no smoking, including e-cigarettes.
Yeah.
Or where people say, sir, you can't smoke that here. I say, I'm vaping. I mean, I don't like being told what to do anyway, but if you're going to tell me what to do, at least get the terminology right.
Yeah.
We've only got a few minutes left. So do we want to have a chat about what the future of regulation in this area is? We're talking about what it is now and the different forms of regulation. How do you think, especially with regard to COP10 happening up the road and the WHO and their position, what do you think is the future of regulation in this area? Is it going to get better over time, or is it going to get worse? What are your thoughts?
I mean, I think there are real threats of it getting a lot worse. Right? You know, in the United States, I don't know where we sit on a federal menthol ban. We thought for sure this was going to happen within the past 6 months, and it's currently on pause. But sort of the FDA's next course of action, they've proposed, well, they've threatened to come up with rules for a very low nicotine content, right? Essentially the cigarette prohibition rules. So the threats are very real from the regulatory sense of becoming a lot more restrictive. I think that, again, common sense science should say that we want more alternative products on the market, but the direction seems to be moving the opposite way from what I can see. And I mean, from everything that we see coming out of COP10, it does not look very friendly to any sort of tobacco products or any kind of ends alternative nicotine consumption.
You've got to bear in mind, I don't think we've mentioned the subject of tax revenue and money very much, but the reality is that e-cigarettes and in products like whatever, any alternative, is a threat to states and governments' tax revenue. And it's not a trivial amount of money. And in a lot of low and middle income countries, it's really quite a sizable sum of money. So you've got an incentive there just to ban the entire category, keep people smoking, keep the money coming in. They won't say this out loud, of course. They'll make all the right noises about how people shouldn't smoke. But the reality is that it's a nice little earner. Some of them might say, well, if people stop smoking, we make all these savings from healthcare costs and so on. But anyone who knows the economics of that knows that this is nonsense. And so either they ban them outright or they tax them. And as I said before, I think about 15 of our European countries in the 90-state index are now taxing e-cigarettes. In some instances, when these taxes are passed by Parliament, politicians make it absolutely clear this is because e-cigarettes are eating our lunch. Smoking rates are going down. We need to find some way to get some more money. Now, an optimistic view of this would be it's going to end up rather like cannabis, in that the reason, let's face it, cannabis has been legalized in a large number of American states and in a growing number of countries is because governments found out they could tax it. Rather than spend a whole lot of money trying to enforce a war on drugs, you can just actually legalize it and you can make a lot of money out of cannabis. We heard from Pablo this morning about Argentina looking to perhaps legalize, Brazil's perhaps looking to legalize. So I wouldn't be surprised if some of the countries that have got prohibitions, as with Finland and Denmark back in the day, decide, actually, let's just legalize this because the prohibition's not working very well anyway. And at some point, they'll probably put a tax on as well. And once the tax is on it, although it's annoying to be taxed on anything, it kind of does make it less likely that the government's going to clamp down in a big way. So maybe that cannabis model, where you kind of basically hook the government into the sale of e-cigarettes in the same way they've been hooked into the sale of tobacco for centuries, that could be the way through the woods.
I don't think I would call myself a pessimist nor an optimist when it comes to this topic. I think I'm relatively pragmatic, though. Having worked for the tobacco industry for a few years, I am very aware of a lot of their strategies going forward in terms of how to deal with issues in terms of overregulation. From a scientist perspective, I know that science is continuously moving forward, and at the end of the day, any type of argument against or for any type of product being in the marketplace is going to have some underlying science to support it. I think what we've seen so far in the U.S. is that when larger companies have their product receive marketing denial orders, they sue. And then they fight it, which will at least keep the product on the market until the FDA can provide any sort of scientific rationale for why that particular product in the marketplace is not appropriate for protection of public health. So I think in the years to come, the pattern will be an MDO followed by a lawsuit, allowing the product to stay on the market to the point where some standards and practices are put into place so that the marketplace can be appropriate for the protection of public health, whatever the definition is of that. But will eventually be on the side of the consumer, not necessarily on the side of a more prohibitionary approach. The problem is things move very slow. And what I'm talking about is not a 2-year plan or a 5-year plan or a 10-year plan. I don't even know the number of years it will take for the states to get to that point. But in the same construct of the menthol ban, that has been around for decades as a potential consequence or a regulatory or law that could impact the choices that consumers have. The VLNC potential rule, when that was first announced, I wrote a response to that, and in reality, the only time that the only research study that showed that VLNC products actually reduced smoking cigarettes per day is when the subjects were provided with an alternative nicotine delivery system. And so if we ever go down the path of VLNC without having alternative nicotine delivery systems in the marketplace, VLNC will fail, any type of nicotine limit will fail horribly in our society and just create additional black markets and so forth. So the pragmatic aspect of it is that I think we'll win in the end, the consumer will win in the end, but the timeline for that is unfortunate. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. It will take a lot of work from people like us in order to allow for it to move forward.
And also with kind of future.
Yeah, I think the big risk in New Zealand is probably more of a knee-jerk reaction to a particular story, whether it's a journalist doing an investigative documentary going into schools and picking out a few kids that vape and interviewing them, or we get a lot of those kinds of documentaries that'll then create the political pressure that causes heavy-handed regulations that are often a lot worse than what they're trying to regulate. So I think that's kind of the area where we see probably the most risk for the worst regulation. On the flip side of that, the new government has created, ironically from the ACT Party, the more libertarian party, they've created a new government department, the Ministry for Regulation. Except I think the logic behind it is that government departments typically do the opposite of what they're named, and so it's actually aimed at deregulation. So they're doing systematic reviews of old regulations because no one knows who created them and why they created them. So they're trying to put in place a better regulatory process so that we can kind of avoid the stuff that's done under the precautionary principle and actually see, is this regulation working how it's intended, and do the benefits outweigh the costs? So that's a positive and a risk.
Brilliant. That's a nice positive note to end on. Thanks very much. So thanks very much, Jim. I really enjoyed that. It was you're the experts in your field, and it was good talking about regulations, even though we don't like regulations, and talking about tax, even though we don't like tax. So yeah, thanks very much for your time, and we're going to move on now with the next panel, which is going to be chaired by Jeffrey here, and it's going to be on some science stuff. So good luck with that.
Absolutely. Thank you.
So you've got break now?
Yeah, but now I just need to find out who's doing regulations. Sit down for a bit.
It's me done.
That's a good side, and it's all digital, so there's no team.
That's right.
I think maybe I'm on one later in the week.
doesn't work. The camera doesn't work. What a relief. Hello, hello.
Are you mic'd up? You mic?
How does it work?
Do you want to mic him up, or should I just pass the mic to him?
You have to put it in like this, right? I think so. Or no, the opposite. Plus, the opposite. Yeah.
I understand.
But is it working?
We'll try to get it to the point where here. Oh, yeah, please. Okay.
Yeah.
We all good? Awesome. Excellent.
We have water, but no glasses, but I got one.
You guys ready? Good afternoon. My name is Jeff Smith. I'm a senior fellow at the R Street Institute in the Integrated Harm Reduction team. And I'm very honored and excited to be the moderator for the first science panel at the Taxpayers Protection Alliance Good Cop, Bad Cop event this week. As a scientist, I am biased in certain ways, but I think this panel is probably one of the most enriched and experienced group of scientists in the world of tobacco harm reduction and in other areas of science beyond nicotine. But today, the focus of our conversation will be around understanding the science, what regulators and lay people, consumers need to know about the science behind both traditional tobacco, combustible tobacco products, as well as the reduced risk products, modern alternative nicotine delivery systems, and so forth. As the moderator, I have two responsibilities. One is to help guide the conversation through the day to make sure that the information that the consumers and others need to have access to is informative and useful for them. The second responsibility is keeping to a 55-minute timeline. I feel very confident, without saying another word, we'll be successful on the first one. Not super confident about the second one, but we'll see how the day goes. So I'd like to start with just simply, I think it's more efficient just to have you each briefly introduce yourself, what your affiliation is, what your general background of expertise is, and then we'll go down the line and we'll do that real quick. So we'll start with you, sir.
Well, thanks for invitation to participate. Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay. My name is Roberto Sussman. I am a theoretical physicist, a senior researcher at the Institute for Nuclear Sciences of the National Autonomous University of Mexico. I work in different areas of physics: general relativity, cosmology, astrophysics, thermodynamics, fluid mechanics, and recently I've been interested also in aerosol physics, either in the COVID application or in electronic cigarettes and heated tobacco products. I'm also a consumer. I'm an ex-smoker, and I use these electronic cigarettes. And, well, I'm happy to address this panel and participate. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so I'm Konstantinos Farsalinos. I'm a physician and a public health expert. I'm an external research associate at the University of Patras and the University of West Africa in Greece. And I've published about 100 papers in the international scientific literature concerning smoking and harm reduction. That's it.
So my name is Dr. Rohan Savio Andrade de Siqueira. I'm half Portuguese, half Indian, so I have the best of both worlds. So I live and work in India. I'm a cardiometabolic physician, so basically my field of expertise is cardiology, diabetes, thyroid, obesity management. This comes under the non-communicable disease section of medicine. I'm also a consumer. I used to smoke before, and then 7 years back, cold turkey, shifted to electronic products, and now I've never turned back. THR is very important to me because I work in one of the most populated countries in the world, a lot of health problems, and it's something which is very exciting to bring changes in people's lives. So that's the reason why I'm here.
Thank you all. So in reality, the scope of this conversation is to talk about the science between, not just within the harm reduction portfolio of products, but really to go back to start with the questions associated with combustible products. So I'd like to start with just a very brief overview from your perspectives of the problems and risks associated with smoking combustible tobacco. And then we'll circle back into terms of what the potential risk might be in terms of the reduced risk products. So anybody would like to start with a combustible question? Rohan?
Yeah. So as you know, combustion is it's an exothermic reaction, right? Where products change, the basic essence of the product changes. You have a very high thermal rate, and it causes a lot of hydrocarbons and a lot of other chemicals which are released. I don't want to sound too technical because the audience or whoever's listening may also get confused. But there's a lot of products in tobacco vapor or in tobacco smoke. It's not vapor, it's smoke. Identified more than 5,000, 6,000 chemicals, of which many are known to cause cancer, definite indication. They cause problems with the endothelium of your arteries. They can cause circulation issues, lung problems, cancers, infertility in some patients. There's a wide range of diseases that can be caused only by smoking cigarettes. We have pregnant women who smoke and create a lot of fetal defects, birth defects, children having effects with oxygenation. That being said, combustion is an exothermic reaction once again, and it is something which we all know from the time man has been smoking cigarettes or using tobacco since 5,000 years. So it's not something new, but there are new alternatives that are coming out. And as a scientific community, as probably the medical fraternity also, should look at products without any bias. They should not be influenced by external factors. Let the scientist in us decide what is good, what is bad. And I think that is lacking right now because information is not available even among the medical fraternity. When you talk to doctors, they say, oh my God, smoking is better than vaping, right? And that's the general consensus. So people do not understand the difference between combustion and aerosols, right? In combustion, you change the chemical nature of a product. But in aerosols, you're just transferring it from one form to the other.
So it's very interesting to me that in your explanation of the risks associated with combustible tobacco, you didn't mention the word nicotine once. Constantinos, do you have any thoughts about, in terms of the risks associated with whether it's from combustion or other sources of nicotine?
Well, I think that's a key point. The key point is to differentiate between smoking and smoke production and nicotine. They are two very different aspects, and unfortunately there is a lot of confusion, and that started from the fact that the main, if not the only source of nicotine for decades has been smoking. So subconsciously, people always associate the effects of smoking, using combustion, with the effects of nicotine. But this is completely different story, and this is, I think, where we have failed to present the huge differences, not only to the society in general, but also to healthcare professionals. I think we are missing a lot in that respect. I think that we have failed to explain to them why nicotine is different from smoke and why the source of nicotine coming from a non-combustible product is very different from nicotine obtained through a combustible product. Why? Because in reality, it's not nicotine that causes disease. And it's that simple. And there is so much science behind that. And it's not only nicotine replacement therapies. The strongest evidence supporting this is coming from the use of alternative harm reduction products. And for a specific product, which is snus, we have decades of long-term epidemiological, clinical evidence. So we're not talking about experimental laboratory studies in animal cell cultures or any other modeling studies or whatever. We're talking about hardcore clinical epidemiological evidence, which is showing that the users of these products, which is not just nicotine, but it's nicotine with some other potentially harmful toxins, have no added risk of developing heart disease, lung disease, or even cancer of the oral cavity, which is the way of using these products. These are oral non-combustible tobacco products. There is no added risk compared to someone who has never smoked and has never used any of these products. And I think this is the most convincing and the highest quality at the same time clinical evidence about nicotine being almost, I would say, almost harmless. I'm not going to say completely harmless, but being almost harmless when it is obtained through a clean, and when I say clean, I mean a non-combustible product, whether it's a tobacco product or a non-tobacco product, because let's not forget that despite some legalities in the terminology, electronic cigarettes, for example, are non-tobacco products. They don't contain any tobacco. So they can't be classified as a tobacco product. I know that in many countries they are classified as tobacco products, and I remember in 2014 in a scientific study that I published, I said that electronic cigarettes are not tobacco products in the same way that biodiesel is not a vegetable product that should be sold in grocery stores, which means that the source of one of its compounds cannot determine the classification of the product. Based on this idea, which in my opinion is simply distortion of reality, many food products contain food additives that are coming from the petroleum industry. But they're not petroleum products, they're food products, you know. So we need to be more convincing, first within the healthcare community, because let's not forget, the healthcare community is the source of information for all citizens or non-experts. And imagine when we have shown that we have published studies showing the level of misinformation and misperception within the scientific community. When you have a healthcare community who doesn't understand the difference between nicotine and smoking, then you expect society to be equally, if not more, misinformed about that distinction and the differences in the risk. But if we want to talk about the purely scientific point, I think it has been well established for many years that nicotine has minimal harm and is not in reality associated with the risks which are smoking related. And unfortunately, I still see some people in the scientific community that are really confusing the two and are discussing about potential harms that may have been shown in some experimental models in animals or in cell studies, but when you look at clinical evidence, which is the highest quality evidence that you expect to have, there is no question right now.
Absolutely.
There's no question.
Excellent. Thank you. So it's maybe interesting to the audience to try to understand why there's a theoretical physicist on the panel. It seems like a very, very different type of science in terms of this compared to epidemiology or toxicology, whatever the case may be. But I will say that one of my good friends and colleagues is a theoretical physicist named Stephen Sears. And he worked within the industry, and his theoretical knowledge and understanding of physics helped product developers design the coils and the heaters associated with reduced risk products to generate, so that it would generate an aerosol that the smoker would enjoy and help increase the probability that they would switch away from a combustible product to the reduced risk products. Can you talk a little bit about your physics and your understanding of why that's important to really understand how to build products that are enjoyable for consumers so they would switch for their health?
Yes, sure. Well, first one correction. To change matter is what you say, it's a correction. Also, without combustion, you change the nature of matter because big molecules decompose in small ones. It's a process called pyrolysis, and it can happen at different levels of energy. And this is precisely what distinguishes these aerosols from smoke. the amount of energy that is involved in the process. For smoking, you need to supply a lot of energy. It can be related to temperature. Temperature is around 900 degrees at the tip of the cigarette. Electronic cigarettes and heated tobacco products are heated at temperatures, electronic cigarettes below 290 degrees, and heated tobacco products below 350. At these temperatures, the heating process involves pyrolysis, but does not involve oxidizing reactions. In fact, you can, and I address this because the WHO now is trying to redefine the concept of smoke to include these aerosols. This is wrong. It is against, there is a rigorous way to distinguish smoke aerosols from aerosols that are not smoke. Is if you produce your experiment in an atmosphere that is free of oxygen, you will never get smoke. Even you supply high temperatures, but you don't get this burning, you don't get ignition, right? And but of course, if you do the experiment in an oxygen-full atmosphere, then there will come a point that if you heat something, you will produce fire. Now, in the case of electronic cigarettes and in the case of heated tobacco products, if you continue supplying heat to the product, there will come a point that you will have fire. But it will happen at temperatures around 400 degrees. No user will survive. I'm not saying enjoy, survive. If you take one of these devices and heat it up to 400 degrees, you get the whole liquid evaporates and it is burning the wick. And at this level, you can say, yeah, it is smoke, but no user will use that. When you use the products at the right ranges, then they are safe. And then you do have reactions that change matter, but they are very low energy. In a sense, in electronic cigarettes, 99 to 97% of the chemistry there is made by 4 elements, 4 compounds: propylene glycol, glycerol, nicotine, and water. Everything else, and you find around 100 and 150 compounds, as opposed to 7,000 in tobacco smoke, every other ones are barely above the quantification limit. See? So basically, and also, these compounds, when they heat, they produce the aerosol. The aerosol is produced when you inhale. There is a vapor, you inhale it, you condense this vapor, and little droplets made of the same material are inhaled. This is what you inhale. On the other hand, when you smoke, you inhale a jungle of gases and particles. Among the 7,000 detected, only detected, about 1,500 are toxic and 70 are carcinogenous. And on the other hand, when you look at electronic cigarettes, the aerosol that is formed, the particles are liquid droplets. There are no solid particles there. And these particles evaporate. And out of the 150 compounds, maybe about 15 are detected above the threshold of detection, and only 3 or 4 are dangerous, and they appear in quantities 2 orders of magnitude, concentrations 2 orders of magnitude, their comparison with a tobacco cigarette. Therefore, but in order to have this safety, you have to use the products in the right ranges. Now, the user is a user anywhere. He doesn't know physical chemistry, he doesn't know aerosols, but his feelings, his sensorial feelings are the guideline. If you are a user and you are you are starting to puff in conditions that are not compliant with this optimal way of usage, you will feel it and you will not go on. Now, and with this I finish. There is a claim, because we have to prove rigorously that these are safer, right? So there are studies that have found very high levels of toxicity. And then you have the CDC, the American Lung Association, the WHO, using these articles to claim that actually electronic cigarettes are not safer than smoking, because now a colleague of mine from France who has a laboratory and other colleagues from Italy, we revised these two studies. We have now revised 163 studies on emissions, right? And what we have but we revise our experimental methods, because it's not enough to say, oh, I detected a lot of formaldehyde. You have to see how they did it, right? And we saw, and I'm not exaggerating in what I'm going to say now, all of them, all the ones that detected toxicity above the toxicological levels, and sometimes even comparable to tobacco smoke, all of them are flawed experiments. They did not follow the right experimental techniques. In different ways, there are technical ways I cannot detail on that, but we have that, and it is published in 3 reviews, and we're sending another one, right? So this is my job. My job, and the people I work with, is to give absolute rigorous scientific support based on experiments that really confirm the relative safety of electronic cigarettes in comparison to cigarettes, right?
So I think what we've done in the first 15 minutes or so is very briefly had elegant science explain, one, a fact that cigarette smoke is dangerous. Long-term use of that product will lead to risks of health. Pretty straightforward. Very easily, we have described the relative risks associated with reduced risk products as compared to a combustible cigarette. I have to use the term relative because I'm a scientist, and include the word risk because I'm a scientist, because no product is zero risk. There's always some potential risk that might exist. But I think most people would look at the science and argue that these products are at least 50% less risky. It's as high as 95% less risky in terms of the long-term use of the product as compared to a combustible product. And then the third thing that we covered was nicotine. And in terms of the primary chemical drug that is delivered through any of these products is nicotine. And the risk of the drug in isolation, nicotine itself, is relatively low. And in terms of the potential positive impact, or at least the enjoyment level of the product, that's often not considered as a rationale or reason as to why.
I would say it's extremely low, and not just relatively low, because relatively low implies somewhat higher level of risk or harm compared to what it really is. You know, the major misconception that we are seeing even today, and I read an article which was published 3 days ago from a heart society, and they were discussing about the risks of nicotine on the cardiovascular system. All of their arguments were simply misconceptions and misperceptions. We have reviews from the early 2000s discussing about the pathophysiological basis of smoking-related cardiovascular disease, and they clearly mention that nicotine is not the cause of the initiation or propagation of atherosclerosis. Or in the worst case scenario, it has minimal effect in the initiation and propagation of atherosclerosis. And we have so much clinical evidence on that, you know, once I was invited in a conference by the American Heart Association, and that was, I think, 2016, 2017, and they were presenting again, data from a mouse study, my study, about the atherogenic effects of nicotine. And when I took the stand and I asked them, and I presented the amount of clinical evidence that we have from snus use. We're talking about tens of years of evidence, long-term follow-up of thousands of people, comparing snus users with never users, never smokers, never users of any kind of nicotine, and they have similar risk for cardiovascular disease, for heart attacks, for strokes. And I said, there is a discrepancy between clinical data and experimental animal data. Which of the two should we trust? The animal data or the human epidemiological data? And they felt a bit embarrassed and they said, yes, there is a discrepancy, we don't know why. Well, it doesn't matter if you know why or not. We can find reasons why this is happening. But what does it matter in terms of science? Are we still doing research on animals and we're killing animals for something that has been solved through clinical research? Doesn't make sense. It's an obsession to try to prove that there's something wrong with a compound that we know there is almost nothing wrong. There is minimal risk.
Yeah, so what is your advice when individuals are faced with regulators saying that the risk is to the user becoming addicted to nicotine?
If someone believes that our lives are associated with zero risk in any of our activities, then he's probably living in a different world. That's simple. Now, when you try to prevent people from having a minimal residual risk, and what you achieve by that is to maintain and propagate the continuous use of the most lethal product, then you are committing in reality a crime, whether you do it intentionally or most likely unintentionally. So the problem with any decision is that there is no accountability and there is no evaluation of the benefits and the harms associated with this decision. We are trying to pursue zero risk in nicotine use, that is, eliminate use of harm reduction products, at a time that we have 1.2 billion smokers in the world. This behavior from some public health experts and from the WHO is as if smoking has already been eliminated, and we're now talking about some residual minimal harm that is coming from nicotine use through non-combustible products. It's far from that. And as I said in the morning in another session, the WHO FCTC is trying to fight smoking by fighting harm reduction. This is impossible to happen. It is a paradox. You cannot do that. You are, by definition, going to fail because you are removing one of the strongest strategies in addressing the smoking risk and the smoking problem, which is a harm reduction strategy. It's like trying to address the problem of traffic accidents and injuries and deaths from traffic accidents and considering that the only answer to the problem of traffic accidents is for people to never enter or drive a car, which you know is impossible to happen because people need the cars, so they will need to drive. And they even need them for pleasure, so it's not only an act in the behavior when you need to go to work, but it's also when you want to have pleasure, you want to go to a trip to a family. So these people behave as if they say, we don't care about seatbelts, we don't care about driving carefully, we don't care about being well-educated to get your driving license, because all these activities carry some residual risk. The only acceptable option is the no risk, the risk aversion option, which is don't enter a car. This is the same thing that is happening now with smoking. It needs to stop because it is damaging, it costs lives. And unfortunately, the WHO is not learning from their own mistakes. They did the same mistakes 40 years ago with drug users. And we paid this mistake with people dying because of the failed strategies and policies of the WHO. The problem today is that today's faults are costing even more lives because the mistakes done with the policy against drug use affected about 20 million people globally who are intravenous drug users. The mistakes that they do today on their policy for smoking affect 1.2 billion smokers. And we cannot let this happen without raising our voices, without explaining the problems, without presenting the totality of evidence and not cherry picking anything that fits our agenda. And we need to publicly declare. We are seeing a case where science is being used not to support decision making, but to support predetermined decisions. So it is used after they make the decisions, and they just adjust it by cherry picking, selectively picking what they like, so that it fits their own predetermined agenda. This is exactly what is happening.
Excellent, thank you. So one of the challenges we have here today is that the World Health Organization is having a meeting down the road. None of us are allowed to participate or be part of it. So in terms of understanding the depth and detail of the conversation and discussions that they're having, it's held in a black box, and we will only hear about it on the other side. What happens on the other side tends to be rules and suggestions in terms of what the signatory countries should implement in terms of tobacco control. And they tend to be the same recommendations, requirements for every country. Rohan, will you talk a little bit about how in India one approach to tobacco control might be successful within the country, and others wouldn't work in terms of how an omnibus rule or law will affect one culture versus another culture?
Right. Before that, I just wanted to touch on something which Constantino just spoke about. We are forgetting a very big elephant in the room. When you're talking about tobacco, you're talking about nicotine, all of these things. And I've kept on saying this all along, everywhere, is that, and I made this statement once at a huge conference, that cigarettes do not kill people. It is your genes. You are genetically predisposed to getting disease. You are genetically predisposed to getting diabetes, your risk factors for heart disease, your risk factors for cholesterol. We are forgetting the entire genetic makeup. I have patients who can smoke 5 packets every day for about 10 years and not have even the hint of cancer. He may have cholesterol, but how can you differentiate whether this happened because of cigarette smoking or because of his genetic makeup, right? So that being said, you're talking about nicotine and you're talking about regulating nicotine. If you look at it from a very superficial view, cigarettes, tobacco pouches or snus, you have your patches, and you have your chewing gums. All of these are just different forms of a drug delivery system. Why are they arguing about one particular drug delivery system, which is electronic cigarettes, with so much of such a big noise, right? Maybe there is a different agenda over there, I do not know, but it's just another drug delivery choice. I choose cigarettes, I choose a vape, I choose a patch, I choose chewing gum, I choose maybe some other device. Why such a big noise about a safer alternating drug delivery system? There's something wrong over here, right? And there is, something behind the scenes which we may not be aware of. So that's beyond the thing. When you talk about regulation in India, same thing happened. India actually got the award for the best, most compliant WHO country for banning cigarettes the e-cigarettes all over the place, right? Not only that, I've been saying this again and again, that they went one step further, and Constantinos knows that he's going to shake his head now, that even they decided to ban research. So now you've not only closed the door, you've put the lock on the door, and you've pulled the shutters down. So there's no possibility of it ever opening until and unless there's a huge policy change. But you're looking at a country of 1.6 billion people, where you have 20 to 25% reported tobacco users. And when I mean tobacco, I'm talking about a range of products. We have such crazy products in India. We have tobacco which is hand-rolled, which is loose tobacco with lime, which is calcium hydroxide. We have a paste which women use in their mouth to cover their gums. We have snuff. We have unfiltered cigarettes, which is called BDs, by the way, no filters at all. And then you have the whole range of cigarette products. Different populations at different socio-economic strata use these products, and the lower down you go on the economic scale, the more risk factors are increased, right? So who is actually getting the main brunt of this disease is people who are living in the remotest villages using the worst possible kind of tobacco, the worst kind of ingredients. they have the highest risk factors for all the other problems like cancer and whatever there is. A policy decision should have included all of the experts. It should have included experts from each of the special areas of industry. Not only that, but they should have got demographic people. They should have got people who speak about the science, like for example, like how Ricardo spoke about the device. Nobody was included. It was a closed door meeting, just 5 or 6 people, selected people, and the vape ban was announced the next day. It was a huge blow, but we're just hoping that this will not have an impact on the health, but it does. But even in spite of that, there is a failure of the policy because vape devices and electronic cigarettes are available everywhere in every city. You just have to go underground. So they just took that whole thing off.
Well, let me comment on the India ban on research, let alone the products. I mean, it's very easy for someone to understand why they have banned research. Because if they had allowed research after banning the products, they would have seen that the decision to ban marketing of e-cigarettes has resulted in a multiplication of the e-cigarette market in India. It has skyrocketed after the ban with products that are completely uncontrolled, completely unregulated, no quality criteria, no one knows where they're coming from, where they are made, how they are made, and that was the outcome of the government decision. Now, do you think that the government would like to see signs like that which would criticize their own decisions? No. Instead, today, I'm sure that they know the situation in the country. You can find today e-cigarettes in every street corner. It was nothing like that before the ban. So what the government does today is pretend to be blind, so think that there is no problem because there is no e-cigarette in the country since we've banned them, while they are everywhere and no one knows what kind of products are there. And of course, they don't want research to show the big political mistake that they've made. So I don't see any paradox in not allowing scientific research in the country concerning this issue.
The same in Mexico. Well, it's a different country, there are different parameters and so on, but we have a similar prohibition. And there was also an award to the Mexican president, not exactly on the prohibition of vapes, because they were not able to pass it as law. It was passed as a decree. But nevertheless, there was a WHO prize. And what we see in Mexico is that smoking prevalence today is basically the same as in 1999. And again, as people have said here, the black market is supplying to everybody. There is a booming black market. Now, we have to distinguish between an informal market, which is not criminal, which people simply sell the devices without being officially registered as a proper business, or with another covered business. This is the informal market. But in Mexico, we have drug cartels, are very aggressive, very violent, and there is a very strong risk. In fact, it's already happening. There are signals that it's already happening that is behind the massive distribution of disposables, right? Because now in Mexico, like Constantino said, and you find them everywhere. And disposables are everywhere in lower class neighborhoods. The informal vendors are small business people. They just do not have the resources or the political connections to introduce this wide distribution. So one prohibition, one award from the WHO is producing a lot of troubles. And that's very worrying, especially now that if you get the criminal market behind that, the cartels there, well, you know what's happening now with fentanyl. Well,
absolutely. Yeah, so I think one thing that should be clear to the audience is that one of the beautiful things about science is that if I disagree with Constantinos, if he presents some data that I disagree with, I can sit down with him, I can talk about his methodology, I can replicate his study to see if my results align with his results or his results are different from the results I produce. And regardless of outcome, it will either lead to agreement or an empirical question that still needs to be asked and understood. So when individuals from the outside of science come in and say that you cannot perform science on a particular product type or whatever, they're eliminating the opportunity for open and free discourse to gain understanding. And so, you know, as a consumer, anyone who is trying to understand the complexity of the world that we live in the context of tobacco harm reduction, eliminating opportunities for conversations taking place behind closed doors instead of out in the open and transparent, instead of publishing and going through the peer review process and allowing for information to be disseminated in a way that allows for consumers and policymakers and others to make decisions that have at least some grounding in science, have been blocked. And then now scientists are being disallowed to practice the skills that they have in order to really aid in the understanding of whatever phenomena that are associated with both nicotine and tobacco product use. Now you tie into the cultural differences and all the other things that are going on in terms of the world, in terms of misinformation and disinformation. It's not surprising that people are confused, right? So I think for the remainder of the time that we have together today is really to think about and get each one of your opinions in terms of what does a path forward look like. We can look at the WHO, we can look at regulators across the globe, and we can identify problems. But what are the steps that are necessary to begin to move forward from whether, again, my bias is a scientific foundation to build upon to move change through that direction. But what do you think is the best path forward in order to protect lives across the globe, and then how do we achieve that? You want to start?
Well, I've been working in the science of this subject in my field, which is physics and physical chemistry, and I have seen that in spite of the work we do, papers that follow the same methodology that we show that is not correct, being published. We are discovering now lots of papers on cell models and cell lines, animal models, or tissues taken from vapors. And we see very similar methodological flaws. We're working on it, but we see that these papers are very well funded. Not Bloomberg. They are funded by the NIH, by the FDI, by the CTP of the FDA. And so they are funding lots of deficient papers whose aim is to find harm. And because science is a corporation, has corporative nature. You have people working there, they have to think of their pensions, their reputation, their salaries, their jobs, their promotions. And it is very easy to weaponize all this in order to fulfill an agenda. I see that clearly. I see all the signs. So, of course, I will continue doing the research I do, but I think that the problem is political. Because it is like playing soccer, but the field is like this. And my goal is here, and the others, the goal is here. So they are going to beat me 17-0 all the time. It's an uphill battle. So where will this come? This requires political changes at global level. How they will come and so on, we don't know. I don't have a magic ball, but you know, what keeps me afloat, and without depression or anything like that, because you feel depressed. You are putting arguments, and you are ignored. We have a little microphone, and then CNN and all, they have huge microphones and so on. Okay, what keeps me afloat? Something very simple, consumption. A product that has been subjected to this level of attack and defamation at the power, higher power levels, institutional, and it is still being used, consumption is increasing. That means that the users are ignoring all these storms that happen on top of the pyramid. On the lower part of the pyramid, users are using. Why? Because they enjoy it, because the products are good. Even the disposables. And, you know, if the disposables were killing people, we would see hundreds of people in hospitals. We would see 20 evalis. We only had one, and it was not caused by nicotine. So consumption goes on. The consumers know that the product is not harming them, and it is enjoyable, and they quit smoking. And this consumption is increasing. There will come a point where they will be a major factor. And the Chinese are probably going to be involved because the Chinese manufacture and export these devices, and it will be very good business. And because in the end, I think that rationality, profit motive, but a rational profit, not a mercenary one, in the end will beat the Puritanism.
Constantino's your thought.
Well, I think from our side, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We should keep on science and use science also to expose the mistakes that have been made in policy implementation and the adverse outcome of those policy implementations. I fully agree with what Roberto said. Our voices are ignored, or even worse, they're not only ignored, but we are personally targeted. Targeted with defamation, with ad hominem attacks, and very few have the courage to withstand that. Many people prefer to avoid it instead of facing it, and fighting it. We shouldn't use their own ways of handling things. We shouldn't cherry-pick evidence. We shouldn't discuss only about benefits, but we should provide an overall picture using the totality of evidence, discussing about all the potential benefits and unintended harms of any kind of approach. But we're not today in a time where we need to think theoretically about it. We already have countries which have implemented harm reduction strategies as their main tools to combat smoking, and they have succeeded. We also have examples of countries who rejected harm reduction strategies, and they have failed miserably in controlling smoking. So perhaps this discussion could have been done 10 years ago, and we would discuss on a theoretical level. Today, we have real-world pragmatic examples. And we just need to communicate these examples. We just need to expose the failures and the successes. And unfortunately, for some people, we need to hold some people accountable for all the mistakes, for this kind of propaganda, I would say, that they propagate, for misleading nations, millions, even billions of people like India, they have more than 1 billion population, misleading them, congratulating them for the biggest failure in policy implementation that we have seen. That's what they're doing. The WHO congratulated India for the e-cigarette ban. They see today what's happening in India, and it seems, because that's how I interpret their behavior, that they don't care about the outcome of the policy. They just care about obeying the WHO rules, or should I call them obsessions, because that's what they are. They don't even look at the outcome in order to realize and accept that that was a failed strategy. For example, the WHO congratulated Turkey a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, about because they implemented all the rules that the WHO has dictated to combat smoking in terms of tobacco control, and Turkey is seeing an increase in smoking rates. But they don't care about the outcome. They care that they followed our rules. It doesn't matter if the rules are succeeding or failing in their objective. What matters is you obeyed to our rules. It doesn't make sense. That's not public health. That's not even proper politics. This is politics of questionable ethical standards. And we need to be clear on that. We shouldn't be afraid of words. This is the reality. We need to present the reality clearly in order to face it. If we start being, polite or discreet, we're not going to succeed in anything. There will be no consensus because these people cannot ever accept that they were wrong. It will take years for the drug war that the WHO was conducting for so many years. It took decades. And consumers, in that case, drug users, had to force themselves into the debate because they were not allowed to enter to the debate. And that's exactly what's happening today with harm reduction products. And the biggest problem which is related to what Roberto said also is that the consumers completely ignore the establishment, is that at the end, science is going to be one of the losers because people will lose faith into science. Mm-hmm. Science will lose its credibility. And then even when we are right, as science, I mean in scientific consensus, no one's going to believe us. And that's going to cause long-term harm, not only in smoking, but also in other health-related aspects.
So we're coming up on time, Rohan, so you get to be our last word of the day. So with being the last word, I always seek positivity, though it's very difficult to be positive in the conversation where we're having today. But what are your thoughts in terms of what the future might look like and what steps we can aid in making that future manifest itself?
So I completely agree with what Roberto and Konstantinos have very beautifully elucidated. And they have touched on many of the multifactorial approaches that were supposed to have been done, but were not done. So there are a lot of stopgaps in the picture. Looking at a solution, or maybe an attempt to a solution, what I feel, and I'm speaking from a perspective from the Asian point of view, we have a lot to learn from COVID, right? If you look at it, there are a lot of parallels between the entire COVID epidemic and what we are facing with right now. Maybe they're two different things, but the principles are practically the same. Here is a virus which came in, we have absolutely no idea what we're dealing with, right? And it's just killing people left, right, and center, and all the doctors and the policymakers are just twiddling thumbs. There was a learning curve. We used everything that was possible in our armamentarium. We learned what works, what doesn't work. And over a period of time, months, 2 months, because it had to be done very quick because people were just dropping like flies. Government, policymakers, bureaucrats then shifted. They knew that they were not in a position to create any policy for this because it was not their expertise. Their own medical teams were not able to form a solution. So they looked at the streets. They said, let's see what's happening over there. They're taking care of the mess over there. And they opened up discussions with doctors all over the country, got inputs from them, created policies, and started opening centers everywhere. That's how a country of 1.6 billion very, very effectively handled COVID. I remember because my team, I was in charge of 6 centers. We handled 45,000 patients in COVID, the whole COVID scene. Doctors need to be the voice which the government will listen to, or policymakers will listen to, because they are at the end. They are the last mile. And I think what has been a deficit in the approach of THR right now is that we are not addressing the doctors and creating awareness among and I think Konstantinos did mention about that right now a few minutes back, completely in support of that. I think there has to be also an effort to educate doctors and provide them the right information, because most of the doctors are also smokers. I know so many of my friends who are surgeons who can't wait to get out of the operation theater because all they need is one drag. Right? We need to educate doctors who will then trickle that information down. And when it's time for a policy making, the medical bodies, when they advise the government, they will definitely not ignore it. But if just individuals like us, we go there and make a big sound, we'll just, like they did at the COP10, they throw everyone out. I think that is one approach which we can look at, but it's going to be an uphill battle, like you said, playing football this way. So.
I think, however, just one comment, because I slightly disagree. The only lesson that we learned from COVID is the exact same lesson that we're learning with the FCTC stance on harm reduction. That some people make decisions which are not science-based, and they are not accountable for them, and they don't admit their mistakes. Unfortunately, this is, in my opinion, the lesson we learned from COVID, because you even see for mistakes that were objective at the end. I mean, after the pandemic, we all saw that it was objective, what happened. We saw articles in the news media discussing about a form of, let's forget about what happened and everything is fine. No. If we forget about what happened, the same things are going to happen again. We can't live in a normal, modern, Western society without accountability for those who make decisions. If we lose any kind of accountability, first of all, that's not democracy, that's not Western democratic values, and we're not going to avoid mistakes that have already happened in the past. But that's a broader discussion,
Yes.
not
Well, the good news
strictly
is
linked to harm reduction.
we still have several days left here at Good Cop, Bad Cop. There will be multiple sessions dealing with both science, policy, as well as the consumer's perspective. So stay tuned over the next few days. More information to come. I'd love to thank the panelists for their wonderful discussion today, and we look forward to more conversation as the conference progresses. Thank you.
Thank you.
I had some COVID commentaries also.